Dove Books on Tape presents The High Window by Raymond Chandler. The house was on Dresden Avenue in the Oak Knoll section of Pasadena, a big, solid-looking house with burgundy brick walls, a terracotta tile roof, and a white stone trim. All I knew about the people was that they were a Mrs. Elizabeth Bright Murdoch and family, and that she wanted to hire a nice, clean private detective who wouldn't drop cigar ashes on the floor and never carried more than one gun. And I knew she was the widow of an old coot with whiskers named Jasper Murdoch, who'd made a lot of money helping out the community, and got his photograph in the Pasadena paper every year on his anniversary, with the years of his birth and death underneath, and the legend, "His life was his service." I left my car in the street and walked over a few dozen stumblestones set into the green lawn and rang the bell. After a while, a middle-aged sourpuss in a maid's costume opened the front door about 8 inches and gave me the beady eye. "Philip Marlowe," I said, "calling on Mrs. Murdoch by appointment." "Which Mrs. Murdoch?" she almost screamed at me. "Mrs. Elizabeth Bright Murdoch," I said. "I didn't know there was more than one." "Well, there is," she snapped. I went in. The room beyond was large and square and sunken and cool and had the restful atmosphere of a funeral chapel and something of the same smell. We left it and went along a hallway, and after a while the sourpuss opened a door and motioned me in and went away grinding her teeth. It was a small room looking out on the back garden. It had an ugly red and brown carpet and was furnished as an office. A thin, fragile-looking blondish girl in shell glasses sat behind a desk with a typewriter on a pulled-out leaf at her left. "I'm Miss Davis, Mrs. Murdoch's secretary. She wanted me to ask you for a few references." "You mean she sent for me without knowing anything about me?" Her lip trembled and she bit it. I didn't know whether she was scared or annoyed or just having trouble being cool and businesslike, but she didn't look happy. "She got your name from the manager of a branch of the California Security Bank, but he doesn't know you personally," she said. "Get your pencil ready," I said. "First off, one of the vice presidents of that same bank, George S. Leake. He's in the main office. Then State Senator Houston Oglethorpe. He may be in Sacramento or he may be at his office in the State Building in L.A. Then, if you'd like a couple of cops, Bernard Olds of the DA's staff and Detective Lieutenant Carl Randall of the Central Homicide Bureau. You think maybe that would be enough?" "Don't laugh at me," she said. "I'm only doing what I'm told." While she was looking up the numbers and telephoning hither and yon, I looked her over. She was pale, with a sort of natural paleness, and she looked healthy enough. Her coarse-grained, coppery blonde hair was not ugly in itself, but it was drawn back so tightly over her narrow head that it almost lost the effect of being hair at all. Her eyes behind the glasses were very large, cobalt blue with big irises and a vague expression. The whole face had a sort of off-key neurotic charm that only needed some clever makeup to be striking. When she was through, she hung the phone book back on a hook and stood up and said, "If you'll just wait a few moments," and went towards the door. Halfway there, she turned back and pushed a top drawer of her desk shut at the side. She went out. The door closed. I went around the desk and pulled open the door she'd come back to shut. I was just curious. It wasn't any of my business that she had a small Colt automatic in the drawer. I shut it and sat down again. She opened the door and said, "Mrs. Murdoch will see you now." We went along some more hallway and she opened half of a double-glass door. I went in and the door was closed behind me. It was so dark in there that at first I couldn't see anything but the outdoor light coming through thick bushes and screens. Then I saw that the room was a sort of sun porch that had been allowed to get completely overgrown outside. There was a reed chaise lounge over by the window. It had a curved back and enough cushions to stuff an elephant, and there was a woman leaning back on it with a wine glass in her hand. Then my eyes got used to the light and I could see her. She had pewter-colored hair set in a ruthless permanent, a hard beak, and large, moist eyes with a sympathetic expression of wet stones. She let me stand while she finished the port in her glass and put the glass down on the table and filled it again. Then she spoke. Her voice had a hard baritone quality and sounded as if it didn't want any nonsense. "Sit down, Mr. Marlowe. I've never had any dealing with private detectives. What are your charges?" "To do what, Mrs. Murdoch?" "It's a very confidential matter, naturally. Nothing to do with the police." "I charge $25 a day, Mrs. Murdoch, and of course expenses." "I see. And what is the nature of the expenses?" "Little things that come up here and there. You never know." "I should prefer to know," she said acidly. "You'll get it all down in black and white. You'll have a chance to object if you don't like it." "And how much retainer would you expect?" "From people in your position, Mrs. Murdoch, I don't necessarily have to have a retainer." She laughed suddenly, and then she belched. "My asthma," she said carelessly. "I drink this wine as medicine. That's why I'm not offering you any. Here's the situation. Something of considerable value has been stolen from me. I want it back, but I want more than that. I don't want anybody arrested. The thief happens to be a member of my family. By marriage. My daughter-in-law. I have a damn fool of a son, but I'm very fond of him. About a year ago, he made an idiotic marriage without my consent. This was foolish of him because he is quite incapable of earning a living, and he has no money except what I give him, and I am not generous with money. The lady he chose, or who chose him, was a nightclub singer. Her name, appropriately enough, was Linda Conquest. They have lived here in this house. I've paid their expenses, given each of them a car, made the lady a sufficient but not gaudy allowance for clothes and so on. No doubt she found life rather dull. No doubt she found my son dull. I find him dull myself. At any rate, she moved out very abruptly a week or so ago without leaving a forwarding address or saying goodbye. What was taken, she went on, was a coin. A rare gold coin called a brasher doubloon. It was the pride of my husband's collection. I care nothing for such things, but he did. I have kept the collection intact since he died 4 years ago. It's upstairs in a locked fireproof room in a set of fireproof cases. It is insured, but I have not reported the loss yet. I don't want to if I can help it. I'm quite sure Linda took it. The coin is said to be worth over $10,000. It's a mint specimen. But pretty hard to sell, I said. Perhaps, I don't know. I didn't miss the coin until yesterday. I should not have missed it then except that a man in Los Angeles named Morningstar called up and said he was a dealer and was the Murdoch brasher, as he called it, for sale. My son happened to take the call. He said he didn't believe it was for sale. It never had been. My son reported the conversation to Miss Davis, who reported it to me. I had her call the man back. I was faintly curious. "Why were you curious, Mrs. Murdoch?" I asked. Just to be saying something. If the man was a dealer of any repute, he would know that the coin was not for sale. My husband provided in his will that no part of his collection might be sold during my lifetime. I spoke to Mr. Morningstar. His full name is Elisha Morningstar, and he has offices in the Belfont building on 9th Street. I told him the Murdoch collection was not for sale, never had been, and that I was surprised that he didn't know that. He hemmed and hawed and then asked me if he might examine the coin. I said certainly not. He thanked me rather dryly and hung up. So I went upstairs to examine the coin myself, something I had not done in a year. It was gone from its place in one of the locked fireproof cases, but I thought then you can probably guess. I said, the part about Mr. Morningstar, maybe. Somebody had offered the coin to him for sale, and he had known or suspected where it came from. How would it be stolen? By anyone in this house, very easily. The keys are in my bag, and my bag lies around here and there. It would be a very simple matter to get hold of the keys long enough to unlock a door and a cabinet and then return the keys. I see. How do you establish that your daughter-in-law took it, Mrs. Murdoch? I don't, in a strictly evidential sense, but I'm quite sure of it. The servants are 3 women who have been here many, many years, long before I married Mr. Murdoch, which was only 7 years ago. My son didn't take it, first, because he is not the kind of fool that steals from his mother, and secondly, if he had taken it, he could easily have prevented me from speaking to the coin dealer. Miss Davis, ridiculous. Just not the type at all, too mousy. No, Mr. Marlowe, Linda is the sort of lady who might do it just for spite, if nothing else. And you know what these nightclub people are. All sorts of people, like the rest of us, I said. No signs of a burglar, I suppose. Maybe I'd better look the room over. I've just told you, Mr. Marlowe, that Mrs. Leslie Murdoch, my daughter-in-law, took the Brasher doubloon. Assuming that's so, Mrs. Murdoch, just what do you want done? In the first place, I want the coin back. In the second place, I want an uncontested divorce for my son, and I don't intend to buy it. I dare say you know how these things are arranged. I may have heard, I said. You say the lady left no forwarding address. Does that mean you have no idea at all where she went? Exactly that. A disappearance, then. Your son might have some ideas he hasn't passed along to you. I'll have to see him. My son knows nothing. He doesn't even know the doubloon has been stolen. When the time comes, I'll handle him. Until then, I want him left alone. He'll do exactly what I want him to. He hasn't always, I said. His marriage, she said nastily, was a momentary impulse. It takes 3 days to have that kind of momentary impulse in California, Mrs. Murdoch. Young man, do you want this job or don't you? I want it if I'm told the facts and allowed to handle the case as I see fit. I don't want it if you're going to make a lot of rules and regulations for me to trip over. This is a delicate family matter, Mr. Marlowe, and it must be handled with delicacy. If you hire me, you'll get all the delicacy I have. If I don't have enough delicacy, maybe you'd better not hire me. You'll do, she said dryly. She bent over sideways and fumbled with the key on a house telephone and growled into it when she was answered. There were steps, and the little copper blonde came tripping into the room with her chin low, as if somebody might be going to take a swing at her. Make this man a check for $250, the old dragon snarled at her, and keep your mouth shut about it. The little girl flushed all the way to her neck. You know I never talk about your affairs, Mrs. Murdoch, she bleated. I wouldn't dream of it. She turned with her head down and ran out of the room. I'll need a photo of the lady and some information, I said when the door was shut again. Look in the desk drawer. I went over and opened the single drawer of the reed desk and took out the photo that lay all alone in the bottom of the drawer, face up, looking at me with cool, dark eyes. A wide, cool, go-to-hell mouth with very kissable lips. The expression of the face lacked something. Once the something might have been called breeding, but these days I didn't know what to call it. I nodded over the photo and slipped it into my pocket. The door opened and the little girl came in with a 3-decker checkbook and a fountain pen and made a desk of her arm for Mrs. Murdoch to sign. The little girl tore the check out and gave it to me. Nothing was said to her, so she went out softly again and closed the door. I shook the check dry, folded it, and sat holding it. What can you tell me about Linda? Practically nothing. Before she married my son, she shared an apartment with a girl named Lois Magic. Charming names these people choose for themselves. Who is an entertainer of some sort. They worked at a place called the Idle Valley Club out Ventura Boulevard way. My son Leslie knows it far too well. I know nothing about Linda's family or origins. You don't know Miss Magic's address? No. Would your son be likely to know? Or Miss Davis? I'll ask my son when he comes in. I don't think so. You can ask Miss Davis. I'm sure she doesn't. I see. You don't know any other friends of Linda's? No. Would you know what money and clothes and jewels she had with her? Not much money. She might have had a couple of $100 at most. Unless, of course, she had found a new friend. If I find she didn't steal the coin, that ends the investigation as far as I'm concerned, correct? We'll talk it over, she said roughly. She let me get to the door before she growled at my back. You don't like me very well, do you? I turned to grin back at her with my hand on the knob. Does anybody? She threw her head back and opened her mouth wide and roared with laughter. I went back along the hall and knocked on the secretary's half-open door and looked in. She had her arms folded on her desk and her face down on the folded arms. She was sobbing. I shut the door and went over beside her and put an arm around her thin shoulders. Cheer up, I said. You ought to feel sorry for her. She thinks she's tough and she's breaking her back trying to live up to it. The little girl jumped erect away from my arm. Don't touch me, she said breathlessly. Please, I never let men touch me. And don't say such awful things about Mrs. Murdoch. She sniffled some more and got a man's handkerchief out of her desk and wiped her eyes with it. I saw on the hanging down corner the initials LM embroidered in purple. Is there something you want? She asked. What do you know about a Miss Lois Magic? I only saw her once. She used to share an apartment with Linda. She came here with a Mr. Vanier. Who's he? She looked down at her desk. She just came with him. I don't know him. Know where Miss Magic lives? She shook her head no. I went out of her office, shut the door firmly, and walked back along the empty halls, through the big, silent, sunken funeral living room and out of the front door. I got into the car and started it and pulled away from the curb. A small sand-colored coupe pulled away from the curb behind me. I didn't think anything of it. The man driving it wore a dark pork-pie-type straw hat with a gay print band, and dark glasses were over his eyes. I drove back towards the city. A dozen blocks later, at a traffic stop, the sand-colored coupe was still behind me. I shrugged and, just for the fun of it, circled a few blocks. The coupe held its position. I dragged my heap around in a fast U-turn and stopped against the curbing. The coupe sailed on and I drove on towards Hollywood. I looked carefully several times, but I didn't spot the coupe again. I had an office in the Cahuenga building, 6th floor, 2 small rooms at the back. I looked into the reception room. It was empty of everything but the smell of dust. I went into the room beyond. I hung my hat and coat on the coat rack and hoisted the phone book onto the desk. Elisha Morningstar was listed at 824 Bellefonte Building, 422 West 9th Street. I had my hand on the instrument when I remembered that I hadn't switched on the buzzer for the reception room. I reached over the side of the desk and clicked it on and caught it right in stride. Somebody had just opened the door of the outer office. It was a slim, tall, self-satisfied-looking number in a tropical worsted suit of slate blue, black and white shoes, a dull ivory-colored shirt, and a tie and display handkerchief the color of jacaranda bloom. As I opened the communicating door, he made a quarter turn and stared at me out of a pair of rather dreamy pale eyes set close to a narrow nose. "You're Marlowe?" I nodded. "I'm a little disappointed," he said. "I rather expected something with dirty fingernails." "Come inside," I said, "and you can be witty sitting down." He sat down on the customer side of the desk, took off the glove from his right hand, and folded this with the other already off and laid them on the desk. "You here on business?" I asked, "or just slumming?" His smile was as faint as a fat lady at a fireman's ball. "The name's Murdoch. You're hired to find my wife, I gather." "That secretary of your mother's has her job hanging by a frayed thread. She talks out of turn." He shook his head sharply. "Mother won't know. Anyhow, Mother couldn't do without Merle. She has to have someone to bully. But why does she want Linda found? I can't understand it. Spending money on it, too. My mother hates to spend money. Look, Marlowe, Please be reasonable and give me an idea what it's all about. I haven't much money, I'm afraid, but would a couple of hundred—" "I ought to bop you," I said. "Besides, I'm not supposed to talk to you. Orders." "Why, for heaven's sake?" "Don't ask me things I don't know. And don't ask me things I do know, because I won't tell you the answers." "I love my wife," he said suddenly, and showed me the hard white edges of his teeth. "She doesn't love me. She was used to a fast-moving sort of life. With us, well, it's been pretty dull. We haven't quarreled, but she hasn't really had a lot of fun being married to me." "You're just too modest," I said. His eyes glinted, but he kept his smooth manner pretty well in place. "I know my mother's not putting out $250 just to be breezy. Maybe it's not Linda. Maybe it's something else. Maybe—" He stopped and then said this very slowly, watching my eyes. "Maybe it's Morny." "Maybe it is," I said cheerfully. "I'm in a spot there all right," he said, "but I didn't think she knew about it. Morny must have called her up." This was easy. I said, "How much are you into him for?" It wasn't so easy. He got suspicious again. "If he called her up, he would have told her, and she would have told you," he said thinly. "Maybe it isn't Morny," I said, beginning to want a drink very badly. "But if it was Morny, how much?" $12,000, he said, looking down and flushing. "Threats?" He nodded. "Tell him to go fly a kite," I said. "What kind of lad is he, tough?" "I suppose he is. He used to be a screen heavy. Good-looking in a flashy way, a chaser. But don't get any ideas. Linda just works there like the waiters and the band, and if you're looking for her, you'll have a hard time finding her." "Why would I have a hard time finding her? She's not buried in the backyard, I hope." He stood up with a flash of anger in his pale eyes. Standing there, leaning over the desk a little, he whipped his right hand up in a neat enough gesture and brought out a small automatic, about .25 caliber with a walnut grip. "If anybody tries to push Linda around, he'll have to push me around first," he said tightly. "That oughtn't to be too hard. Better get more gun unless you're just thinking of bees." He put the little gun back in his pocket. I said, "As a matter of fact, I don't even think you are worried about your wife. She didn't run away from you at all. She just ran away from your mother. Perhaps she'll get a job and make enough money to support you." He turned his body to the right a little, and the fist made a tight, unrelaxed arc through the air upwards. I moved my jaw out of the way, and caught his wrist and pushed it slowly back against his chest, leaning on it. He slid a foot back on the floor and began to breathe hard. We stood there looking into each other's eyes. He tried to jerk his wrist away, but I put so much weight on him that he had to take another short step back to brace himself. "How come your old man didn't leave you some money?" I sneered. "Or did you blow it all?" "If it's any of your rotten business and you mean Jasper Murdoch, he wasn't my father. He didn't like me and he didn't leave me a cent. My father was a man named Horace Bright who lost his money in the crash and jumped out of his office window." "You milk easy," I said, "but you give pretty thin milk. I'm sorry for what I said about your wife supporting you. I just wanted to get your goat." I dropped his wrist and stepped back. "Well, you got it. If you're satisfied, I'll be on my way." He opened the door and went on out. I went back to the desk and lifted the phone. After the bell had rung 3 times at the other end of the line, the phone clicked and a man spoke. "This is Mr. Morningstar." "I'm told you called Mrs. Murdoch in Pasadena, Mr. Morningstar, about a certain coin. My understanding is that you wish to buy the coin in question from the Murdoch collection." "Indeed. And who are you, sir?" "Philip Marlowe, a private detective. I'm working for Mrs. Murdoch." "And what did you wish to talk to me about?" "About this coin. But I was informed it was not for sale. I still want to talk to you about it, in person." "You mean she's changed her mind about selling?" "No." "Then what have we to talk about?" "The point is, Mr. Morningstar, that at the time you called up you already knew the coin wasn't for sale." "Interesting," he said slowly. How? You're in the business, you couldn't help knowing. It's a matter of public record that the Murdoch collection can't be sold during Mrs. Murdoch's lifetime. There was a silence. Then, at 3 o'clock, I shall be glad to see you here in my office. I hung up and lit my pipe and sat there looking at the wall. I called Kenny Haste, a crime reporter on the Chronicle. What do you know about Alex Morney? I asked him when we were through cracking wise at each other. Runs a plush nightclub in Idle Valley. Used to be in pictures. Seems to have plenty of protection. Dangerous? I'd say he might be, if necessary. He has a bodyguard who's quite a character. His name's Eddie Prue. He's about 6 feet 5 inches tall and thin as an honest alibi. He has a frozen eye, the result of a war wound. Do you know a girl named Lois Magic, said to be an entertainer, a tall, gaudy blonde, I hear? No. Sounds as though I might like to. Do you know anybody named Vanier? Nope. But I could ask Gertie Arbogast, if you want to call back. He knows all the nightclub aristocrats. And heels. Thanks, Kenny, I'll do that. Half an hour? He said that would be fine, and we hung up. I locked the office and left. At the end of the corridor, in the angle of the wall, a youngish blond man in a brown suit and a cocoa-colored straw hat with a brown and yellow tropical print band was reading the evening paper with his back to the wall. He got into the elevator with me. I went out on the street and walked a block to the bank to deposit my check and draw out a little folding money for expenses. From there I went to the Tiger Tail Lounge and drank a martini and ate a sandwich. The man in the brown suit posted himself at the end of the bar and drank Coca-Colas and looked bored. I dragged my sandwich out as long as I could and then strolled back to the telephone booth at the inner end of the bar. I dialed the Chronicle office again. Okay, Kenny Haste said. Gertie Arbogast says Morney married your gaudy blonde not very long ago, Lois Magic. He doesn't know Vanier. He says Morney bought a place out beyond Bel Air, a white house on Stillwood Crescent Drive, about 5 blocks north of Sunset. Gertie says Morney took it over from a busted flush named Arthur Blake Popham, who got caught in a mail fraud rap. Many thanks, Kenny. I hung up, stepped out of the booth. I spun around and went back through a swing door into the kitchen and through that to the alley and along the alley a quarter block to the back of the parking lot where I'd put my car. No sand-colored coupe succeeded in getting behind me as I drove off in the general direction of Bel Air. Stillwood Crescent Drive curved leisurely north from Sunset Boulevard, well beyond the Bel Air Country Club golf course. I drove up slowly, looking for monograms on gates. Arthur Blake Popham was the name. ABP would be the initials. I found them gilt on a black shield, the gates folded back on a black composition driveway. It was a glaring white house that had the air of being brand new, but the landscaping was well advanced. I hammered on a large brass knocker. Back along the side of the house, a chauffeur was washing off a Cadillac. The door opened and a hard-eyed Filipino in a white coat curled his lip at me. I gave him a card. Mrs. Morney, I said. He shut the door. Time passed as it always does when I go calling. The door opened. The Filipino poked my card at me. She not at home. Didn't you know that when I gave you the card? I know when she tell me. He shut the door in my face. I walked along the side of the house to where the chauffeur was squirting water on the Cadillac. I said, "Where's the boss?" "Ask at the house, Jack." I done ask. They done shut the door in my face. You're breaking my heart, Jack. How about Mrs. Morney? How's the little old expense account? He asked in a small, careful voice. For $5, I could start thinking. I wouldn't want to make it that tough for you. For $10, I could sing like 4 canaries in a steel guitar. I don't like these plushy orchestrations, I said. He cocked his head sideways. Talk English, Jack. All I want to know is whether Mrs. Morney is home. I gave him $2. She's in the backyard with a friend, he said. You got a friend that don't work and a husband that works, you're all set, see? He leered. A rather large blonde cocker spaniel tore around the Cadillac, hit me in the stomach and thighs with all four paws, ran around my legs, sat down between them, and started to pant. A male voice called, "Here, Heathcliff!" A man came into view through the opening of a latticed tunnel covered with climbing roses. Tall, dark, with a clear olive skin, gleaming white teeth. A narrow black mustache. Sideburns too long, much too long. He snapped a clear, hard voice. "Here, Heathcliff! Come here at once!" The dog breathed hard and didn't move, except to lean a little closer to my right leg. "Who are you?" the man asked, staring me down. I held out my card. The dog quietly backed out from between my legs and faded silently into the distance. "What do you want?" "Want to see Mrs. Morney. Are you Mr. Morney?" "That's Mr. Vanier," the chauffeur said behind my back, in a drawled, over-polite voice of deliberate insolence. "Mr. Vanier is a friend of the family." Vanier looked past my shoulder, his eyes furious. "Could you bring yourself to say what point you wish to discuss with Mrs. Morney?" "I'd prefer to explain that to Mrs. Morney herself." "The implication is that she doesn't care to see you." Behind the car, the chauffeur said, "Watch his right, Jack. It might have a knife in it." Vanier's olive skin turned the color of dried seaweed. He turned on his heel and rapped at me in a stifled voice. "Follow me." He went along the brick path under the tunnel of roses and through a white gate at the end. Beyond was a walled-in garden. Beside the pool there was a flagged space set with blue and white garden furniture. A long-limbed, languorous type of showgirl blonde lay at her ease in one of the chairs. From 30 feet away she looked like a lot of class. From 10 feet away she looked like something made up to be seen from 30 feet away. She wore white duck slacks, blue and white open-toed sandals over bare feet, and crimson toenails, a white silk blouse and a necklace of green stones that were not square-cut emeralds. I said, "I'm looking for a friend of yours, Mrs. Morney. I understand that she shared an apartment with you about a year ago. Her name is Linda Conquest." The blonde looked at me and said, "I don't think I've seen her in 6 months. She got married." "Then you don't know where she is, Mrs. Morney?" "Didn't I say so?" "No. You said you didn't think you'd seen her in 6 months. Not quite the same thing. You think Mr. Morney could help me? Or would?" "How would I know?" "You could try. If he don't like you, he has guys around that can bounce you." "I think you could tell me yourself if you wanted to." "How are you going to make me want to?" Her eyes were inviting. "With all these people around," I said, "how can I?" "That's a thought," she said, and sipped from her glass, watching me over it. Vanier stood up very slowly. His face was white. He put his hand inside his shirt and said slowly between his teeth, "Get out, mug, while you can still walk." I looked at him in surprise. "Where's your refinement? And don't tell me you wear a gun with your garden clothes." The blonde laughed, showing a fine set of teeth. I turned and walked away across the grass. The red-eyed chauffeur was still at work on the Cadillac. "How you come out?" he asked me out of the side of his mouth. "Badly. They trampled all over me," I said. "Who is this guy Vanier? What's he do?" "Women, my guess would be," he said. "Isn't it a bit dangerous playing with this particular woman?" "I'd say it was," he agreed. "Different guys got different ideas of danger." "Where does he live?" "Sherman Oaks." "Ever run across a girl named Linda Conquest? Tall, dark, handsome, used to be a singer with a band?" He shook his head. "I don't know the party. All kinds of dames come here, mostly pretty flashy. I don't get introduced." I went back along the black driveway. He stood there, scratching his chin. I drove along the block looking for a place to park so that I could run up to the office for a moment before going on downtown. It was only then that I noticed the car in front of which I had parked was a familiar-looking sand-colored coupe. I went into the office, looked on the floor for mail, didn't find any, bought myself a short drink out of the office bottle, and left. I was below Sunset on Vine before he picked me up. I drove all the way downtown on 3rd. The sand-colored coupe kept half a block behind me all the way. I parked near 7th and Olive. At Spring I went into the Hotel Metropole, strolled over to the Big Horseshoe cigar counter to light one of my cigarettes, and then sat down in one of the old brown leather chairs in the lobby. A blond man in a brown suit, dark glasses, and the now familiar hat came into the lobby and sat down with his back to a pillar. I got up and wandered over and dropped into the chair beside him. I looked at him sideways. He didn't move. Behind the dark glasses, his eyelashes flicked up and down rapidly. I struck a match and held the flame to his cigarette. Light? Oh, thanks, he said, very surprised. He looked at me sideways several times before he spoke. Haven't I seen you somewhere before? Over on Dresden Avenue in Pasadena this morning. I could see his cheeks get pinker than they had been. He sighed. I must be lousy, he said. Boy, you stink, I agreed. Maybe it's the hat, he said. The hat helps, I said, but you don't really need it. Did you want something with me, or are you just practicing? I figured I'd find out if you were smart enough to be worth talking to. I'm very smart, I said. It would be a shame not to talk to me. He drew a small pigskin wallet out. He handed me a nice, fresh card from it. It read, George Anson Phillips, Confidential Investigations, 212 Sanger Building, 1924 North Wilcox Avenue, Hollywood. A Glenview telephone number. I slipped the card into my pocket. You want one of mine, or have you completed your file on me? Oh, I know all about you, he said. I was a deputy at Ventura the time you were working on the Gregson case. I remembered your name when I saw it on your registration this AM. So when I lost you on the way into town, I just looked you up. I figured we could maybe make a deal. Pool our resources, as they say. I saw the guy go into your office, so I figured he'd hired you. You knew who he was? I'm working on him, he said, and his voice sounded flat and discouraged. And where I'm getting is no place at all. What did he do to you? Well, I'm working for his wife. Divorce? He looked all around him carefully and said in a small voice, So she says, but I wonder. They both want one, I said, each trying to get something on the other. Comical, isn't it? My end I don't like so well. A guy's tailing me around some of the time, a very tall guy with a funny eye. I shake him, but after a while I see him again. Anything to do with you? Never saw him that I know of. We better get together and talk this thing over properly, but I can't do it now. I have an appointment. I'd like to, he said, very much. My office, my apartment, or your office, or where? My apartment. Give me that card a minute. He turned it over on his palm when I gave it to him and wrote slowly with a small metal pen, moving his tongue along his lips. 204 Florence Apartments, 128 Court Street. I looked at him curiously. Court Street on Bunker Hill? He nodded, flushing all over his blond skin. Not too good, he said quickly. I haven't been in the chips lately. Do you mind? No, why would I? Just between the two of us, this divorce stuff is a lot of hooey. It's something else entirely, isn't it? Yeah, he said softly, and something I don't like more every minute I think about it. Here. He pulled something out of his pocket and dropped it into my hand. It was a flat key. No need for you to wait around in the hall if I happen to be out. I have 2 of them. What time would you think you'd come over? About 4:30 the way it looks now. You sure you want to give me this key? Why, we're in the same racket, he said, looking up at me innocently, or as innocently as he could look through a pair of dark glasses. The Belfont building was 8 stories of nothing in particular that had got itself pinched off between a large green and chromium cut-rate suit emporium and a 3-story and basement garage. There were 2 open grill elevators, but only one seemed to be running, and that not busy. An old man sat inside it, slack-jawed and watery-eyed on a piece of folded burlap on top of a wooden stool. I got in with him and said 8, and we dragged upwards, lurching. I got out at my floor and started along the hallway. Elisha Morningstar's office was at the back opposite the fire door. I turned the knob and went into a small, narrow room with a dust-gray floor carpet. An inner wooden door was open at the back. Then the dry voice of Elisha Morningstar called out, "Come in, please, come in." In the swivel chair at the desk sat an elderly party in a dark gray suit. He had some stringy white hair that grew long enough to tickle his ears. He said, "You are Mr. Marlowe?" I nodded. "Pray be seated." "Well, Mr. Marlowe, what can I do for you?" "Tell me about the Brasher doubloon." "Ah, yes," he said, "the Brasher doubloon. It's a gold coin, roughly equivalent to a $20 gold piece and about the size of a $half, almost exactly. It was made for the state of New York in the year 1787. It was not minted. There were no mints until 1793, when the first mint was opened in Philadelphia. The Brasher doubloon was coined probably by the pressure molding process, and its maker was a private goldsmith named Ephraim Brasher. The two halves of the mold were engraved in steel, in intaglio, of course. These halves were then mounted in lead. Gold blanks were pressed between them in a coin press. Then the edges were trimmed for weight and smoothed. "Kind of a slow process," I said. "Quite. And since the surface hardening of steel without distortion could not be accomplished at that time, the dies wore and had to be remade from time to time, with consequent slight variations in design which would be visible under strong magnification. In fact, it would be safe to say no two of the coins would be identical, judged by modern methods of microscopic examination. How many of these coins are there, and what are they worth? A few hundred, 1,000, perhaps more. But of these, very few indeed are uncirculated specimens in what is called mint condition. The value varies from a couple of thousand on up. I should say that at the present time, since the devaluation of the dollar, an uncirculated specimen carefully handled by a reputable dealer might easily bring $10,000 or even more. "And now," I said, "let's talk about the Brasher doubloon that somebody tried to sell you." "Oh, did somebody try to sell me a Brasher doubloon? Now, why would they do that?" "They needed the money," I said, "and they didn't want too many questions asked." "And you assume this from the mere fact that I called up Mrs. Murdoch and asked if her Brasher doubloon was for sale?" "Sure. She had the same idea herself." "It's reasonable. Like I said over the phone to you, you'd know that coin was not for sale if you knew anything about the business at all, and I can see that you do." "You would be offered this coin for sale," I said, "in suspicious circumstances. You'd want to buy it if you could get it cheap and had the money to handle it. But you would want to know where it came from, and even if you were quite sure it was stolen, you could still buy it if you could get it cheap enough. By buying the coin, cheap, you'd be protecting the owner or his insurance carrier from complete loss. They'd be glad to pay you back your outlay. It's done all the time." "Then the Murdoch Brasher has been stolen," he said abruptly. "Don't quote me," I said. "It's a secret." "And how much will your principal pay for the return of the coin?" I leaned over the desk and gave him my shady leer. $1,000. "What did you pay?" $800, he said. $800 for an uncirculated specimen of the Brasher doubloon, he chortled. "Fine. Got it with you? That leaves you $200. A quick turnover, a reasonable profit, and no trouble for anybody." "It's not in my office," he said. "You take me for a fool? Let us say 11 in the morning. Come back with your money. The coin may or may not be here, but if I'm satisfied with your behavior, I'll arrange matters. That's satisfactory, I said, and stood up. I have to get the money anyhow. At 11 a.m., he said, and no tricks, Mr. Marlowe. Don't think I don't know how to protect myself. I hope you do, I said, because what you're handling is dynamite. I left him and tramped across the empty outer office and opened the door and let it shut, staying inside. I sneaked back across the threadbare carpet and edged in behind the door. Nothing happened for a while except that a nose was blown. Then a swivel chair squeaked. The threshing sound of a telephone being dialed. I lunged across to the instrument on the little typewriter desk and lifted it. At the other end of the line, the bell had started to ring. It rang 6 times. Then a man's voice said, "Yeah?" "The Florence Apartments?" "Yeah. I'd like to speak to Mr. Anson in apartment 204. "Hold the wire. I'll see if he's in." Mr. Morningstar and I held the wire. Noise came over it, the blaring sound of a loud radio broadcasting a baseball game. Then I could hear the hollow sound of steps coming nearer and the harsh rattle of the telephone receiver being picked up, and the voice said, "Not in. Any message?" "I'll call later," Mr. Morningstar said. I hung up fast and did a rapid glide across the floor to the entrance door and opened it very silently, like snow falling, and let it close the same way. Bunker Hill is Old Town, Lost Town, Shabby Town, Cook Town. I was earlier than 4:30 getting over there, but not much. I parked at the end of the street and walked along Court Street to the Florence Apartments. The entrance door had a glass panel and enough of the name left to be read. I opened it and went down 3 brass-bound steps into a hallway you could touch on both sides without stretching. I went up the stairs. Apartment 204 was on the right side, and the baseball game was right across the hall from it. I knocked, got no answer, and knocked louder. I knocked a 3rd time while I felt in my pocket for the key George Anson Phillips had given me. I put the key into the door and went in. A square room with a brown carpet. Very little furniture, and that not inviting. There was a door on either side of the bed. The door to the left led into a small kitchenette with a brown woodstone sink and an old electric icebox that clicked and began to throb in torment just as I pushed the door open. I went back around the wall bed and through the other door. It gave on a short hallway with an open space for clothes and a built-in dresser. I pushed the bathroom door. It opened about a foot and then stuck. My nose twitched and I could feel my lips stiffen, and I smelled the harsh, sharp, bitter smell from beyond the door. I poked my head through the opening. The floor of the bathroom was too short for him, so his knees were poked up and hung outward slackly, and his head was pressed against the woodstone baseboard at the other end, not tilted up, but jammed tight. His right hand was thrown across his stomach. His left hand lay on the floor, palm up. The fingers curled a little. There was a blood-caked bruise on the right side of his head in the blonde hair. His open mouth was full of shiny crimson blood. The door was stopped by his leg. I pushed hard and edged around it and got in. I bent down to push 2 fingers into the side of his neck against the big artery. No artery throbbed there, or even whispered. I pulled away from the door and pulled it open and went back through the hall into the living room. I took out the flat key George Anson Phillips had given me and rubbed it between my moist palms and laid it down beside the lamp. I smeared the doorknob, opening the door, and the outside knob, closing the door. I went back down the stairs and stood in the half-dark of the hall looking at a small enameled plate on a door that read "Manager." I knocked on the door. "You the manager?" "Yeah." It was the same voice I'd heard over the telephone, talking to Elisha Morningstar. He was a lanky man with carroty short hair growing down to a point on his forehead. He had a long nose that would be into things. I said, "Mr. Anson?" 204. "He's not in." "What should I do, lay an egg?" "Neat," I said. "You have them all the time, or is this your birthday?" "Beat it," he said. "Drift." $5, I said. It rocked him. "Come in," he said. I sat down. We looked at each other with the clear, innocent eyes of a couple of used car salesmen. I got my wallet out and selected a card from it. It wasn't my card. It read, "James B. Pollock, Reliance Indemnity Company, Field Agent." I handed the Carity man the card. He read it and scratched the end of his nose with one of the corners. "Wrong, John?" he asked, keeping his green eyes plastered to my face. "Jewelry," I said, and waved a hand. He thought this over. "We get one once in a while," he conceded. "You can't help it." He didn't look like it to me, though. Soft-looking. I didn't figure him for no crook, but hell, they come all sizes and shapes. "Let's say we frisk the apartment while he's out." He shook his head. "Mr. Palermo wouldn't like it." "Mr. Palermo?" "He's the owner, across the street. Owns the funeral parlors, owns this building and a lot of other buildings. Practically owns the district, if you know what I mean. Gets the vote out." "Well, while he's getting the vote out, or whatever he's doing at the moment, let's go up and frisk the apartment." "Don't get me sore at you," the Carity man said briefly. "That would bother me like 2% of nothing at all," I said. The Carity man stood up suddenly and took hold of his lower lip with his teeth. "You said something about 5. "That was hours ago," I said. "I thought better of it. Let's go up and frisk the apartment." "Say that just once more." His right hand slid towards his hip. "If you're thinking of pulling a gun, Mr. Palermo wouldn't like it," I said. "To hell with Mr. Palermo." He put a hat on, but no coat, opened a drawer and took out a bunch of keys, walked past me to open the door and stood in it, jerking his chin at me. We went out into the hall and along it and up the stairs. The Carity man selected one of his keys and put it in the lock of apartment 204. Against the booming of the dance band behind us in the apartment across the way, a woman's voice suddenly screamed hysterically. The Carity man withdrew the key and bared his teeth at me. He walked across the narrow hallway and banged on the opposite door. The door was jerked open and a sharp-faced blonde in scarlet slacks and a green pullover stared out with sultry eyes, one of which was puffed and the other had been socked several days ago. "Pipe down, but soon," the Carity man said. "Next time I call some law." The girl looked back over her shoulder and screamed against the noise of the radio. "Hey, Dell, the guy says to pipe down. You want to sock him?" A chair squeaked. The radio noise died abruptly, and a thick, bitter-eyed, dark man appeared behind the blonde, yanked her out of the way with one hand, and pushed his face at us. "Buzz off. I just come in from lunch. I had a lousy lunch. I wouldn't want nobody to push muscle at me." The Carity man said, "You heard me, Mr. Hench. Dim that radio and stop the roughhouse in here." The man addressed as Hench said, "Listen, Picklepuss," and heaved forward with his right foot in a hard stamp. The Carity man's left foot didn't wait to be stamped on. The Carity man hit him on the top of his head and the girl screamed. Hench turned blindly, stumbled and ran across the floor in a lurch that threatened to land him on his nose at every step. Hench made the bed on one knee and plunged a hand under the pillow. I said, "Look out! Gun!" "I can fade that too," the Carity man said between his teeth, and slid his right hand, empty now, under his open vest. Hench was down on both knees. He came up on one and turned, and there was a short black gun in his right hand, and he was staring down at it, not holding it by the grip at all, holding it flat on his palm. "This ain't my gun!" I said, "Drop it, Hench." He looked up at me, puzzled, dark eyes suddenly sober. "It ain't my gun," he said, and held it out flat. "Mine's a Colt 32, belly gun." I took the gun off his hand. He made no effort to stop me. I sniffed the gun. It had been fired. I sprang the magazine out and counted the bullets through the small holes in the side. There were 6. With one in the magazine, that made 7. The gun was a Colt 32 automatic, 8-shot. "Better get some law," I said. "A shot has been fired from this gun, and it's about time you found out there's a dead man in the apartment across the hall." "Shot in the throat with a medium-caliber gun and a soft-nosed bullet," Detective Lieutenant Jesse Breeze said. "A gun like this and bullets like is in here." He danced the gun on his hand. The gun Hench had said was not his gun. He was a big man, rather paunchy. He would be about 50 years old, and the only thing about him that very much suggested cop was the calm, unwinking, unwavering stare of his prominent pale blue eyes, a stare that had no thought of being rude, but that anybody but a cop would feel to be rude. We were sitting in Hench's apartment, and the door was shut. Hench said thickly, "If the idea is the guy was shot with the gun under the pillow, okay. Seems like he might have been. It ain't my gun, and nothing you boys can think up is going to make me say it's my gun." "Assuming that to be so," Breeze said, "how come? Somebody swiped your gun and left this one? When? How?" "We went out about 3:30 or so to get something to eat at the hash house around the corner," Hench said. "We must have left the door unlocked. We were kind of hitting the bottle a little. I guess we were pretty noisy." Breeze said, "Hitting the hooch like you birds been and having a gun under the pillow, sooner or later somebody was going to get shot. You ought to know that." "Hell, we didn't even know the guy," Hench said. Breeze said, "You left your door open or unlocked. The killer heard you go out. He got into your apartment wanting to ditch his gun, saw the bed down, walked across and slipped his gun under the pillow, and then imagine his surprise. He found an other gun there waiting for him, so he took it along. Now, if he meant to ditch his gun, why not do it where he did his killing? Why take the risk of going into another apartment to do it?" I put in my nickel's worth, saying, "Suppose, coming out of the shock of his murder, he found himself in the hall still holding the murder gun. He would want to ditch it fast. Then if Hench's door was open and he'd heard them go out along the hall." Breeze looked at me briefly and grunted, "I'm not saying it isn't so, I'm just considering." He went over to the door, then turned and stood looking at the girl on the bed. "You all right, sister, or should I call for a matron?" The girl on the bed didn't answer him. Breeze went out the door. He came back into the room with a young, fresh-faced, plainclothes detective. "This is Lieutenant Spangler," he said. "He'll take you down. Get going, huh?" Hench went back to the bed and shook the girl's shoulder. "Get on up, babe. We got to take a ride." The door closed. Breeze and I sat looking at each other heavily. After a while, Breeze got tired of looking at me and dug a cigar out of his pocket. "You and me," he said, "are going to get along." "You don't think so, but we are. But not because I took any sudden fancy to you. It's the way I work. Everything sensible, everything quiet." He took a card out of his pocket and read from that. "James B. Pollock, Reliance Indemnity Company, Field Agent. What's the idea?" "In a neighborhood like this, it's bad form to use your own name," I said. Anson didn't either. "What I'd like to know," Breeze said, "is what you know about the dead guy." "I know that his name is George Anson Phillips, that he claimed to be a private detective. He followed me downtown into the lobby of the Hotel Metropole. I spoke to him, and he admitted he'd been following me and said it was because he wanted to find out if I was smart enough to do business with. He was on a job he had got leery of, and he wanted to join up with somebody, perhaps somebody with a little more experience than he had, if he had any at all." "What you working on?" I shook my head and didn't answer. "This is murder," Breeze said. "You're going to have to tell me." I shook my head again. "Of course you know I can throw you in the can as a material witness," he said casually. I said, "Are you going to do it?" He smiled bleakly. "You got a lawyer?" "I know several lawyers. I don't have a lawyer on a retainer basis." "Why don't you go on home and let a man work?" he asked crossly. I got up and nodded and went towards the door. "So long," he said drearily. "Don't leave town. We'll want a statement." It was 6:45 when I let myself into the office and clicked the light on and picked a piece of paper off the floor. It was a notice from the Green Feather Messenger Service saying that a package was held, awaiting my call, and would be delivered upon request at any hour of the day or night. I pulled the phone over and looked at the number on the slip and called it. They said my package could be sent right over. 10 minutes later, the door was knocked on, and I opened it to a boy in a uniform cap who took my signature and gave me a small, square package, not more than 2.5 inches wide. The label had my name and address printed on it in ink, in a quite fair imitation of typed letters larger and thinner than pica. Inside was a thin, cheap cardboard box pasted over with brown paper and stamped "Made in Japan" with a rubber stamp. The lid fitted down all the way and tightly. I pulled it off and saw tissue paper and cotton wool. Separating these, I was looking at a gold coin about the size of a $50, bright and shining as if it had just come from the mint. The side facing me showed a spread eagle with a shield for a breast and the initials E.B. punched into the left wing. At the bottom was the date, 1787. I was looking at the brasher doubloon. I filled an empty tobacco pouch half full, wrapped the coin up in tissue paper, snapped a rubber band around it and tucked it into the tobacco in the pouch and put more in on top. I closed the zipper and put the pouch in my pocket. I got a shoulder holster out of the desk and strapped it on and slipped a Colt .38 automatic into it. Put on hat and coat and had the office door unlatched when the phone rang. I went back and leaned on the desk and answered. After what seemed a very long time, there was the quiet, remote whisper of a voice saying dimly without any tone, "Too bad for you, Marlowe." Then the click and the droning on the wire, and I hung up and went back across the office and out. I drove west on Sunset, then parked near a drugstore and went into its phone booth. I dropped my nickel and asked the O operator for a Pasadena number. She told me how much money to put in. A soft but very clear voice said, "Mrs. Murdoch's residence. Philip Marlowe here. Mrs. Murdoch, please." "Mr. Marlowe? Mrs. Murdoch is resting now. Can you tell me what it is?" "You oughtn't to have told him." "I? Who?" "That loopy guy's handkerchief you cry into." "How dare you?" "That's fine," I said. "Now let me talk to Mrs. Murdoch. I have to." "Very well, I'll try." The voice went away and I waited a long time. "This is Mrs. Murdoch. Could you identify the property we were talking about this morning, Mrs. Murdoch? I mean, could you pick it out from others just like it?" "Well, are there others just like it?" "Dozens, hundreds for all I know." "I suppose I couldn't identify it then, but in the circumstances—" "That's what I'm getting at, Mrs. Murdoch. The identification would seem to depend on tracing the history of the article back to you." "Why? Do you know where it is?" "Mr. Morningstar claims to have seen it. He says it was offered to him for sale, just as you suspected. He wouldn't buy." "It's not important now." "Not important?" "No. Have you anything else to report?" "Another question to ask. Do you know a youngish blond fellow named George Anson Phillips, claimed to be a private detective?" "I do not. Why should I?" "I don't know. He enters the picture somewhere. I think he was the one who tried to sell the article." "Anything else?" "Yes. I agreed to pay Morningstar $1,000 for the return of the article. He said he could get it for $800. "This is all very unnecessary now, Mr. Marlowe. I have decided to drop the matter. The coin has been returned to me." "Just like that? I hope you're not too disappointed," she said. "The circumstances are a little difficult. I may decide to explain, and I may not. You may call at the house tomorrow morning. Since I do not wish to proceed with the investigation, you will keep the retainer as payment in full." "One moment, Mrs. Murdoch. It isn't going to be as simple as all that. Things have happened." "In the morning you may tell me about them," she said sharply, and hung up. The hock shop was on Santa Monica near Wilcox, a quiet, old-fashioned little place, washed gently by the lapping waves of time. An old Jew in a tall black skull cap came along behind the counter, smiling at me over cut-out glasses. I got my tobacco pouch out, got the brasher doubloon out of that and laid it on the counter. The Jew took the coin and lifted it on his hand. "Gold, is it? A gold hoarder you are, maybe," he said, twinkling. $25, I said. "The wife and the kiddies are hungry." "Oy, that's terrible." He weighed it casually on a pair of small scales. "Gold it is," he said. "So $10 you're wanting?" $25. "For $25, what would I do with it? Sell it, maybe?" For $15 worth of gold is maybe in it. You got a good safe? Mister, in this business are the best safes money can buy. Make out the ticket. He wrote it out partly with his pen and partly with his tongue. I walked down to the corner drugstore and bought an envelope and borrowed a pen and mailed the pawn ticket to myself. In the Belfont building, a few windows glowed here and there, but not many. The same old plow horse sat in the elevator on his piece of folded burlap. I said, I don't suppose you know where I can get in touch with the building superintendent. You want something? I want the address of one of the tenants. Which one? Mr. Morningstar. He ain't home, still in his office. Are you sure? Sure, I'm sure. He ain't been down yet. I got into the car and said 8. He wrestled the door shut and we ground our way up. At the end of the corridor, 2 doors were alight. They were the only 2 in sight that were. I opened the door marked entrance and stepped into the narrow office with the small closed typewriter desk. The wooden door was still ajar. I walked along to it and knocked on the wood and said, Mr. Morningstar. No answer. The hairs moved on the back of my neck. I stepped around the door. The ceiling light glowed down on the glass cover of the jeweler's scales, on the old polished wood around the leather desktop, down the side of the desk, on a square-toed, elastic-sided black shoe with a white cotton sock above it. The shoe was at the wrong angle, pointing to the corner of the ceiling. The rest of the leg was behind the corner of the big safe. He lay crumpled on his back, very lonely, very dead. The safe door was wide open and keys hung in the lock of the inner compartment. A metal drawer was pulled out. It was empty now. I didn't touch him except to bend over and put the back of my hand against his livid, violet-colored face. Blood had oozed from the side of his forehead where he'd been hit. But there was no powder smell on the air this time, and the violet color of his skin showed that he had died of a heart stoppage due to shock and fear, probably. That didn't make it any less murder. I called the receiving hospital from the corner, giving no name. It was 10 o'clock in the evening. I was home at the apartment. I had a pipe in my mouth, and nothing on my mind except 2 murders and the mystery of how Mrs. Elizabeth Bright Murdoch had got her brasher doubloon back while I still had it in my pocket. The bell rang at the door. I stepped around the table and picked the Colt .38 off the drop leaf of the oak desk and went over to the door, holding it down beside my right leg. Who is it? Breeze. I went back to the desk to lay the gun down again before I opened the door. Breeze stood there looking just as big and sloppy as ever, but a little more tired. The young, fresh-faced Dick named Spangler was with him. Spangler left the door and crossed the room to the dinette, looked in there, recrossed, and went into the hall. Nobody here, he said. Breeze nodded and sat down. Spangler saw the gun lying on the desk. He said, "Mind if I look?" I said, "Phooey on you both." Spangler walked to the gun and held the muzzle to his nose, sniffing. He broke the magazine out, ejected the shell in the chamber, picked it up and pressed it into the magazine. He laid the magazine on the desk and held the gun so that light went into the open bottom of the breech. "A little dust," he said, "not much." "What do you expect?" I said. "Rubies." "We know damn well it wasn't a long .38 anyway," he said. "Just what are you guys talking about?" I asked. Breeze said, "You always have a gun lying around in your desk?" "Except when it's under my pillow," I said. "We didn't come here to get tough, Marlowe." "That's fine," I said. "So you prowl my apartment and handle my property without asking my permission. What do you do when you get tough? Knock me down and kick me in the face?" "Oh, hell," he said and grinned. I grinned back. "We're not trying to pull anything that's not legitimate. We only hope you ain't either." "Ain't either what?" "Ain't either trying to pull anything not legitimate, such as holding out on us." why shouldn't I hold out on you if I feel like it? I asked. You're not paying my salary. We're on a murder case, Breeze said. You found the body. You talked to the guy. You said you didn't know what he wanted to see you about. We figured that maybe with time to think back you could have remembered. In other words, I was lying the first time, I said. When what you say begins to make sense, we'll be satisfied. I never saw Phillips before today, I said. He wanted to talk to me. He gave me his key. I went to his apartment, used the key to let myself in when he didn't answer, as he told me to do. He was dead. He watched me with a quiet up-from-under look. You're on a job. We don't know what it is. Phillips was playing at being a private dick. He was on a job. He tailed you around. How can we know unless you tell us that his job and your job don't tie in somewhere? And if they do, that's our business, right? That's one way to look at it, I said. But it's not the only way, and it's not my way. Until you guys own your own souls, you don't own mine. Until you guys can be trusted every time and always, in all times and conditions, to seek the truth out and find it and let the chips fall where they may, until that time comes, I have a right to listen to my conscience and protect my client the best way I can. Until I'm sure you won't do him more harm than you'll do the truth good. Or until I'm hauled before somebody that can make me talk. You sound to me just a little like a guy who's trying to hold his conscience down, Breeze said. What'd you find out about Phillips? I asked. Well, George Anson Phillips is a kind of pathetic case. He thought he was a detective, but it looks as if he couldn't get anybody to agree with him. George put an ad in the paper and he might have got a customer out of that. I guess he did, because about a week ago, George went over to Court Street and took an apartment under the name of Anson and got bumped off. What about this ad? Breeze dug a thin piece of paper out of his wallet and put it down on the cocktail table. It said, "Why worry? Why be doubtful or confused? Consult cool, careful, confidential investigator, George Anson Phillips, Glenview 9521. It ain't any worse than lots of business personals, Breeze said. What about the gun Hench said wasn't his? It's the right gun. We don't have the slug yet, but we have the shell. You believe somebody planted it under Hench's pillow? Sure. Why would Hench shoot Phillips? He didn't know him. How do you know that? I know it, Breeze said, spreading his hands. Look, there are things you know because you have them down in black and white, and there are things you know because they are reasonable and have to be so. It's God's truth, Breeze said slowly, that I don't know what to make of you. I can't see you deliberately covering up on any murder, and neither can I see you knowing as little about all this as you pretend to know. I didn't say anything. Breeze put on his hat and stood up. How long you expect to stay dummied up? He asked. I don't know. Let me help you out. I give you till tomorrow noon, a little better than 12 hours. I give you till then to talk things over with your party and decide to come clean. And after that? After that, I see the captain of detectives and tell him a private eye named Philip Marlowe is withholding information which I need in a murder investigation, or I'm pretty sure he is. I figure he'll pull you in fast enough to singe your britches. I said, uh-huh. Did you go through Philip's desk? Sure. A very neat young feller. Nothing in it at all except a little kind of diary. Nothing in that either except about how he went to the beach or took some girl to the pictures and she didn't warm up much. There was only one thing about it. It was all done in a kind of printing. I said, printing? Yeah, printing in pen and ink. Not big block caps like people trying to disguise things. Just neat, fast little printing as if the guy could write that way as fast and easy as any way. We better beat it. They both went over to the door. Breeze looked at me sideways with his hand on the doorknob. You know any tall blondes? I'd have to think, I said. How tall? Just tall. A wop named Palermo owns that apartment house on Court Street. We went across to see him in his funeral parlors. He says he saw a tall blonde come out of the apartment house about 3:30. The manager, Passmore, don't place anybody in the joint that he would call a tall blonde. The wop says she was a looker. The two of them went along the hallway towards the elevator. The telephone rang. I picked it up and growled into it. "Marlowe?" The voice was a harsh, low whisper. It was a harsh, low whisper I'd heard before. "All right," I said. "Talk it up, whoever you are." "Maybe you're a smart guy," the harsh whisper said. "Maybe you'd like to do yourself some good." "How much good?" "Say about 5 C's worth of good." "Doing what?" "Keeping your nose clean," the voice said. "Want to talk about it?" "Where, when, and who to?" "Idle Valley Club, Morny. Any time you get here." "Who are you?" A dim chuckle came over the wire. "Just ask at the gate for Eddie Prue." It was nearly 11:30 when I backed my car out of the garage and drove towards Cahuenga Pass. The lobby looked like a high-budget musical. A lot of sound, an all-star cast, and a plot with all the originality and drive of a split fingernail. I went into the bar and sank into a leather bar seat packed with down. The barman moved slowly along the bar to the end where I sat and stood looking away from me with nothing in his face but pallor. Then he turned to me and said, "Yes, sir?" "I want to talk to a fellow named Eddie Prue." "Your name?" "Marlowe." "Drink while waiting?" "A dry martini'll do." I carried the drink over to a small table against the wall and sat down there and lit a cigarette. A girl was singing. She had a rich deep down around the ankles contralto that was pleasant to listen to. A man at the next table said to his girl, "They got Linda Conquest back with the band. I heard she got married to some rich guy in Pasadena, but it didn't take." I started to get up, but a shadow fell across my table and a man was standing there. A great long gallows of a man with a ravaged face and a haggard frozen right eye that had a clotted iris and the steady look of blindness. "I'm Prue," the man said in his harsh whisper. So I gathered. You want to talk to me, I want to talk to you, and I want to talk to the girl that just sang. Let's go. There was a locked door at the back end of the bar. Prue unlocked it and stood aside for me to pass him. It was a cozy sort of office, not too large. There was a built-in upholstered corner seat by the French windows, and a man in a white dinner jacket was standing with his back to the room, looking out. The man at the window turned around and showed me that he was going on 50 and had soft ash-gray hair and plenty of it, and a heavy, handsome face with nothing unusual about it except a short, puckered scar on his left cheek that had almost the effect of a deep dimple. He looked at me with no expression and said, "You're Marlowe?" I nodded. "Sit down." I sat down. Eddie Prue sat in a chair against the wall and tilted the front legs off the floor. "I don't like peepers," Morny said. "I don't like 'em when they question my driver or when they get tough with my guests. On the other hand, just at the moment, I might have a use for you. It might pay you to play ball with me." "How much might it pay me?" I asked. "It might pay you in time and health. Just mind your business and I'll mind my business and we won't have any trouble." I said it might be that my business and your business would get a little mixed up together, through no fault of mine. "In what way?" "Well, for instance, your hard boy here calling me up on the phone and trying to scare me to death. And later in the evening calling me up and talking about 5 C's and how it would do me some good to drive out here and talk to you. And for instance, that same hard boy following around after a fellow in my business who happened to get shot this afternoon on Court Street on Bunker Hill." Morny lifted his cigarette away from his lips and narrowed his eyes to look at the tip. "Who got shot?" "A guy named Phillips, a youngish blonde kid. He was a peeper." "I never heard of him," Morny said. "And also, for instance, a tall blonde who didn't live there was seen coming out of the apartment house just after he was killed," I said. "What tall blonde?" "I don't know that. Of course, she need not have anything to do with Phillips." "Why was he killed and how?" "He was sapped and shot in his apartment. We don't know why he was killed. If we knew that, we would likely know who killed him. Who is we? The police and myself. I found him dead, so I had to stick around. Morny said, "You told the cops what?" I said very little. "I gather from your opening remarks to me here that you know I'm looking for Linda Conquest, Mrs. Leslie Murdoch. I found her. She's singing here. It seems to me that your wife or Mr. Vanier might have told me, but they didn't." "What my wife would tell a peeper," Morny said, "you could put in a gnat's eye." "No doubt she has her reasons," I said. "However, that's not very important now. In fact, it's not very important that I see Miss Conquest. Just the same, I'd like to talk to her a little if you don't mind." "Suppose I mind," Morny said. "I guess I'd like to talk to her anyway." "You wasted your time coming here." "I got the idea that I was asked to come here." "You can go to hell and back any time you want to," Morny said. "Or you can do a little job for me, for $500. Either way, you leave Eddie and me out of any conversations you might have with the police." "What's the nature of the job?" "You were at my house this morning. You ought to have an idea." "I don't do divorce business," I said. His face turned white. "I love my wife," he said. "We've only been married 8 months. I don't want any divorce. She's a swell girl and she knows what time it is as a rule, but I think she's playing with a wrong number at the moment. Let me get this straight. Are you hiring me on a job or off a job I already have?" He didn't answer me. "And let me get another thing straight. You don't mind your wife playing around, but you don't want her playing around with somebody named Vanier, is that it?" "I trust her heart," he said slowly, "but I don't trust her judgment." "And you want me to get something on this man Vanier?" "I want to find out what he's up to." "Oh, is he up to something?" He stared at me levelly for a moment, then he pulled the middle drawer of his desk out, reached in and tossed a folded paper across to me. I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a carbon copy of a gray billhead. Cal Western Dental Supply Company and an address. The bill was for 30 pounds Kerr's Cristobalite, $15.75, and 25 pounds White's Albastone, $7.75, plus tax. It was made out to H.R. Teeger, will call, and stamped paid with a rubber stamp. It was signed for in the corner L.G. Vanier. I put it down on the desk. "That fell out of his pocket one night when he was here," Morny said, "about 10 days ago. Eddie put one of his big feet on it and Vanier didn't notice he dropped it. Is this supposed to mean something to me?" "I thought you were a smart detective. I figured you could find out." Morny went to the black and chromium safe against the wall and opened it. He came back with 5 new bills spread out in his fingers like a poker hand. "There's your 5 C's," he said. "Take Vanier out of my wife's life and they'll be the same again for you." I poked at the crisp new bills with a hungry finger. Then I pushed them away. "You can pay me when and if I deliver," I said. "I'll take my payment tonight in a short interview with Miss Conquest. And as for this Phillips murder, Eddie here was following Phillips a little. You want to tell me why?" "No." "Murdoch owes you some money, doesn't he?" He frowned. "I don't discuss things like that. I'll send Linda up to talk to you." He went to the door and out. Eddie Prue unwound his long body and stood up, and gave me a dim gray smile that meant nothing, and wandered off after Morny. I lit another cigarette and looked at the dental supply company's bill again. Something squirmed at the back of my mind, dimly. Linda Conquest came in through the open door behind me and shut it, and stood looking at me with a cold light in her eyes. She looked like her photo and not like it. She had the wide, cool mouth, the short nose, the wide, cool eyes, the dark hair parted in the middle and the broad white line between the parting. "You're a man named Marlowe?" she asked, looking at me. She put her hips against the end of the desk and crossed her ankles. I said I was a man named Marlowe. "By and large," she said, "I'm quite sure I'm not going to like you one damned little bit, so speak your piece and drift away." "She wants it back, quickly. It has to be fast or there'll be trouble. She wants what back, Mr. Marlowe? The brasher doubloon. You mean she thinks I took it? Yeah, just that. She's a dirty old liar, Linda Conquest said. Why would I take her silly old coin? She thinks you might need money. I gather she was not too generous. She laughed a tight, sneering little laugh. No, she said, Mrs. Elizabeth Bright Murdoch would not rate as very generous. Maybe you just took it for spite, kind of, I said hopefully. Maybe I ought to slap your face. Passing on from that to perhaps more important matters, I said, will you give him a divorce? For 25 grand, she said, not looking at me, I should be glad to. You're not in love with the guy, huh? You're breaking my heart, Marlowe. He's in love with you, I said. After all, you did marry him. Mister, don't think I didn't pay for that mistake, but a girl has to live, and it isn't always as easy as it looks. That port-sodden old fake made the bargain too rough. How do you like her for a client? I've had worse. You notice what she's doing to that girl? Merle? I noticed she bullied her. It isn't just that. The girl had a shock of some kind, and the old brute has used the effect of it to dominate the girl completely. Something funny's going to happen in that family one of these days. I'm glad I won't be there. That's a smart and ruthless woman, Marlowe. Whatever she's got you doing, it's not what she says. She's up to something. Would she kill a couple of men? She laughed. No kidding, I said. A couple of men have been killed, and one of them at least is connected with rare coins. You tell Morny all that? About one of them. We stared at each other. You know a fellow named Vanier? Yes, not well. He's a friend of Lois. A very good friend. One of these days he's apt to turn out to be a small, quiet funeral, too. Hints, I said, have sort of been thrown in that direction. She said quietly, Morny will sure as hell kill him if he doesn't lay off Lois. Vanier hasn't anything to do with my job anyway. He has no connection with the Murdochs. No? Let me tell you something. Vanier knows Elizabeth Bright Murdoch, and well. He never came to the house but once while I was there, but he called on the phone plenty of times. I caught some of the calls. He always asked for Merle. Well, that's funny, I said. Merle, huh? I stood there for a moment looking at her and wondering. Then I said, good night and thanks. It was 2 o'clock when I got back to Hollywood and put the car away and went upstairs to my apartment. I opened the windows and flushed the place through while I undressed and stripped the pockets of my suit. Out of them, with other things, came the dental supply company's bill. I dragged the phone book up on the desk in the living room and looked up H.R. Teager. Then the confused memory clicked into place. His address was 422 West 9th Street. The address of the Bellefonte building was 422 West 9th Street. But even the Pinkertons have to sleep, and Marlowe needed far, far more sleep than the Pinkertons. I went to bed. It was just as hot in Pasadena as the day before, and in the same sunless sunroom. Mrs. Elizabeth Bright Murdoch sat in the same reed chaise lounge, and as I came into the room she was pouring herself a slug from what looked like the same port bottle, but was more probably a grandchild. Things are bad, I said. The cops are after me. She looked as flustered as a side of beef. Indeed, I thought you were more competent than that. When I left here yesterday morning, a man followed me in a coupe. I shook him off, but he followed me again, so I invited him to explain why, and he said he knew who I was and he needed help, and asked me to come to his apartment on Bunker Hill and talk to him. I went. After I had seen Mr. Morningstar and found the man shot to death on the floor of his bathroom. His name is George Anson Phillips. He claimed to be a private detective. I never heard of him, Mrs. Murdoch said coldly. I never saw him to my knowledge and don't know anything about him. Did you think I employed him to follow you? He gave me the impression that he was working for some member of your family. He wasn't. You can be quite definite on that. I don't think you know quite as much about your family as you think you do, Mrs. Murdoch. I know you have been questioning my son, contrary to my orders, she said coldly. I didn't question him. He questioned me, or tried to. What about this man you found shot? You are involved with the police on account of him? Naturally, but that's only the half of it. I saw Morning Star. I told you about that over the phone. He pretended not to have the Brasher doubloon, but admitted it had been offered to him and said he could get it, as I told you. Then you told me it had been returned to you, so that was that. I tried to get in touch with him to tell him the deal was off. I went to his office. The elevator man said he was still in his office. He was lying on his back on the floor, dead, killed by a blow on the head and shock, apparently. Old men die easily. The blow might not have been intended to kill him. I called the receiving hospital but didn't give my name. What do you want me to do? I'm connected with one murder already by having found the body and reported it. I may presently be connected with another by having found the body and not reported it, which is much more serious for me. Even as far as it goes, I have until noon today to disclose the name of my client. That, she said, would be a breach of confidence. You're not going to do that, I'm sure. I felt myself getting pinched around the nose. I'm working for you, I said. Now. This week, today. Next week I'll be working for somebody else, I hope, and the week after that for still somebody else. In order to do that, I have to be on reasonably good terms with the police. I value your business, Mrs. Murdoch, but not enough to cut my throat for you and bleed in your lap. You seem to have made a nice mess of the whole thing, she said. She poured some more wine and gulped it too fast and went into a paroxysm of coughing. I jumped up and went over and landed one on her beefy back that would have shaken the city hall. She let out a long, strangled wail and drew her breath in rackingly and stopped coughing. I pressed one of the keys on her dictaphone box. When somebody answered, I said, "Bring Mrs. Murdoch a glass of water, quick," and then let the key up again. When her breath was coming evenly and without effort, I said, "You're not tough. You just think you're tough. You've been living too long with people that are scared of you." The door opened and the maid came in with a pitcher of ice water and a glass. She put them down on the table and went out. I poured Mrs. Murdoch a glass of water and put it in her hand. "You're a callous brute," she said. "You're a cold-blooded fish. I don't like you. I deeply regret ever having met you." "Mutual," I said. She reached a thick finger to a key and barked into the talking box. "Merle, ask my son to come in here at once, and I think you may as well come in with him." She released the key, pressed her broad fingers together, and let her hands drop heavily to her thighs. "My son took the coin, Mr. Marlowe, my own son." In a couple of minutes they both came in and she barked at them to sit down. "All right, son, tell Mr. Marlowe about the doubloon." Murdoch looked up at me quickly and then dropped his eyes. "As I told you yesterday in your office, I owe Morny a lot of money. I didn't want Mother to know. He was pressing me pretty hard for payment. I took the doubloon, using her keys one afternoon when she was asleep and Merle was out. I gave it to Morny and he agreed to hold it as security because I explained to him that he couldn't get anything like $12,000 for it unless he could give its history and show that it was legitimately in his possession. Morny gave me a receipt in which he agreed to hold the coin as collateral and not to convert it without notice and demand. When this man, Morning Star, called up and asked about the coin, I immediately became suspicious that Morny either was trying to sell it or that he was at least thinking of selling it and was trying to get a valuation on it. When Merle told me Mother had employed a detective, then I was sure she had missed the doubloon and had hired you on that account. I didn't really believe she'd hired you to find Linda. I knew where Linda was all the time. I went to your office to see what I could find out. I went to see Morny yesterday afternoon and told him about it. At first he laughed in my face, but when I told him that even my mother couldn't sell the coin without violating the terms of Jasper Murdoch's will, and that she would certainly set the police on him when I told her where the coin was, then he loosened up. He got up and went to the safe and got the coin out and handed it to me without a word. I gave him back his receipt and he tore it up, so I brought the coin home and told Mother about it. In the silence that followed, I said, "Did Morny threaten you?" He shook his head. He said he wanted his money and he needed it, and I had better get busy and dig it up, but he wasn't threatening. Where was this? At the Idle Valley Club in his private office. Was Eddie Prue there? Mrs. Murdoch said thickly, "Who is Eddie Prue?" "Morny's bodyguard," I said. I looked at her son waiting. He said, "No, I didn't see him." I said, "That seems to take care of that, then." Mrs. Murdoch said heavily, "Kiss your mother, son, and run along." He got up dutifully and went over and kissed her on the forehead. He went out of the room with his head down and quietly shut the door. I said to Merle, "I think you'd better have him dictate that to you just the way he told it and make a copy of it and get him to sign it." The old woman snarled, "She certainly won't do anything of the sort. Go back to your work, Merle." Merle went out softly. "I'm very fond of my son, Mr. Marlowe. This grieves me deeply. Do you think he'll have to tell this story to the police?" "Did he make it up himself, or did you think it up and teach it to him?" "Mr. Marlowe," she said in a deadly voice, "you are treading on very thin ice." "Aren't we all?" "All right, suppose it's true. Morney'll deny it and we'll be right back where we started. Morney'll have to deny it because otherwise it would tie him to a couple of murders. I found your daughter-in-law, Mrs. Murdoch. She's back where she started, singing with the band at the Idle Valley Club. She doesn't like you very well. I don't find it impossible to think that she took the coin all right, partly from spite. And I find it slightly less impossible to believe that Leslie knew it or found it out and cooked up that yarn to protect her." She smiled. "Yes," she said gently. "Yes, poor Leslie. He would do just that. And in that case—" She stopped and her smile widened until it was almost ecstatic. "In that case, my dear daughter-in-law may be involved in murder." "And you just love that," I said. "I don't like your tone. I don't like your tone at all." "I don't blame you," I said. "I don't like it myself. I don't like this house, or you, or the air of repression in the joint, or the squeezed-down face of the little girl, or that twerp of a son you have, or this case, or the truth I'm not told about it, and the lies I am told about, and—" She started yelling then, noise out of a splotched, furious face, eyes tossing with fury, sharp with hate. "Get out! Get out of this house at once!" I gave her a sort of tired leer and picked my way to the door and opened it and went out. Steps gibbered along after me and my name was called. I stopped and turned and let her catch up with me, her eyes trying to pop through her glasses. "Mr. Marlowe, please don't go away. She wants you. She really does." "The hell with her," I said. "She's a fat-faced old liar." "Oh, I'm sure if you would only be patient." I put my arm around her shoulders without thinking. She jumped about 3 feet and her eyes blazed with panic. "Look," I said slowly, "did something happen to you when you were a little girl?" She nodded very quickly. "A man scared you or something like that?" She nodded again. She took her lower lip between her little white teeth. "And you've been like this ever since?" She just stood there looking white. "Look," I said, "if I touched you, it was just like touching a chair or a door. It didn't mean anything. Is that clear?" "Yes." She got a word out at last. "That takes care of me. Now why don't you get over it? Is he still around, this other one that hurt you?" She put her hand to her mouth and gnawed the fleshy part at the base of the thumb, looking at me over it, as if it were a balcony. "He's dead," she said. "He fell out of a window." "Oh, that guy. I heard about him." "Forget it, can't you?" "No," she said, "I can't. I can't seem to forget it at all. Mrs. Murdoch is always telling me to forget it, but I just can't. I was his secretary. She was his wife. He was her first husband." "Look," I said, "is there someone you meet that has that effect on you? Some one person more than another?" "Why do I have to tell you?" she breathed. "You don't. It's just how you feel about it." She opened her mouth and put a funny little confiding smile on her face, and then it went wrong. Her throat froze up. She turned and ran. I heard her steps going along the hall. I heard a door close. I went after her along the hall and reached the door. She was sobbing behind it. There was nothing I could do about it. I went back to the glass porch and knocked on the door and opened it and put my head in. Mrs. Murdoch sat just as I had left her. "Who's scaring the life out of that little girl?" I asked her. "Get out of my house," she said between her fat lips. I let myself out of the house. I stood there listening to the sunshine burn the grass. Detective Lieutenant Jesse Breeze stretched his arms high in the air and yawned and said, "Couple of hours late, ain't you?" I said, "Yes, but I left a message for you that I would be. Sit down." He had a small littered desk across one corner of the room. Spangler was sitting sideways at a smaller and much neater desk. Hench confessed. I said, "What did you use on him, a pickaxe?" "We used a wop on him," Breeze said. "A wop named Palermo. Was like this. Hench was drunk. He was drunk deep inside, not just on the surface. He'd got to the point where liquor wasn't making him drunk, it was keeping him sober. When a guy gets like that and you take his liquor away and don't give him any to hold him down, he's a lost cuckoo." "I thought you were sure Hench was innocent." Breeze nodded vaguely. "That was last night. Anyway, in the night, bang, Hench is bugs. So they drag him over to the hospital ward and shoot him up full of hop. Well, this AM, he's fine. Hop's still working. The guy is pale but peaceful. We go see him. After a while, he opens his trap just enough to say Palermo. Palermo's the name of the wop across the street that owns the funeral home and the apartment house and stuff. So we come back here and phone Palermo. We talk like this. Hench wants to see you, Mr. Palermo. He wanna see me? That's a fine. I see him alone, without any coppers. I say, okay, Mr. Palermo, and we go over to the hospital ward and Palermo talks to Hench and nobody listens. After a while, Palermo comes out and he says, okay, copper. He make the confess. I pay the lawyer, maybe. I like the poor guy, just like that. He goes away, so we go in with a steno and Hench gives us the dope. Phillips made a pass at Hench's girl. That was day before yesterday out in the hall. Yesterday afternoon, he sees Phillips go into his apartment. Hench knocks on Phillips' door and Phillips opens it. Hench goes in and tells Phillips how he feels and what he's going to do, and Phillips is scared and pulls a gun. Hench hits him with a sap. Phillips falls down and Hench ain't satisfied. Hench picks the gun off the floor and he's very drunk there, being dissatisfied, and Phillips grabs for his ankle. Hench doesn't know why he did what he did then. He's all fuzzy in the head. He drags Phillips into the bathroom and gives him the business with his own gun. You like it? I love it, I said, but what's the satisfaction in it for Hench? Well, you know how a drunk is. It ain't Hench's gun, you see, but he can't make a suicide out of it. There wouldn't be any satisfaction for him in that. So Hench takes the gun away and puts it under his pillow and takes his own gun out and ditches it. He won't tell us where. Then he finds the girl and they eat. Will he cop a plea? Sure, I think so. I figured Palermo could get him off with manslaughter. Why would Palermo want to get him off with anything? He kind of likes Hench. And Palermo's a guy we can't push around. I said, I see. I stood up. Spangler looked at me sideways along glistening eyes. What about the girl? Won't say a word. She's smart. You wouldn't kick, would you? Whatever your business is, it's still your business. Get me? And the girl is a tall blonde, I said. Not of the freshest, but still a tall blonde. Nothing in that, Marlowe, not enough class. Cleaned up and sober, you never can tell, I said. Class is a thing that has a way of dissolving rapidly in alcohol. That all you want with me? Guess so. Not that I wouldn't like to hear your story, but I don't figure I have an absolute right to insist on it the way things are. Mr. Pietro Palermo was sitting in a room which, except for a mahogany roll-top desk, a sacred triptych in gilt frames, and a large ebony and ivory crucifixion, looked exactly like a Victorian parlor. Across the street I could see the windows of the apartment where George Anson Phillips had been killed. The tall Italian with the dark skin and the handsome head of iron-gray hair read my card and said, I got business in 12 minutes. What do you want, Mr. Marlowe? I'm the man that found the dead man across the street yesterday. He was a friend of mine. You saw a tall blonde woman come out of there yesterday. He studied me. Not yesterday. Was 2 or 3 days ago. I tell the coppers yesterday. He snapped his long, dark fingers. The coppers. Bah! Did you see any strangers yesterday, Mr. Palermo?
He's a back away in and out, he said.
This morning you saw Hench. He lifted his eyes and ran them lazily over my face.
Did the coppers tell you that, huh?
They told me you got Hench to confess. They said he was a friend of yours. How good a friend they don't know, of course.
Hench make her to confess, huh?
He smiled, a sudden, brilliant smile. Only Hench didn't do the killing, I said.
No?
No.
That's interesting. Go on, Mr. Marlowe.
The confession is a lot of baloney. You got him to make it for some reason of your own. He stood up and went to the door and called out, "Tony!" A short, tough-looking Italian came into the room, looked at me and sat down against the wall in a straight chair.
"Tony, this man, Mr. Marlowe. You look at this man very good, Tony. Not to forget him, huh?"
Tony said, "Leave it to me, Mr. Palermo." Palermo said,
"Was a friend to you, huh?"
"Yeah."
"That's bad. I tell you something. A man's friend is a man's friend, so I tell you. But you don't tell nobody else. Not the damn coppers, huh?"
"No."
"I come of a large family, many sisters and brothers. One brother very bad, almost so bad as Tony."
Tony grinned.
"Okay, this brother live very quiet across the street. Gotta move, okay? The coppers fill the joint up, not so good. Ask too many questions. Not good for business, not good for this bad brother. You get the idea?"
"Yeah," I said, "I get the idea."
"Okay, this Hench no good, but a poor guy, drunk, no job, paying no rent, but I got lots of money. So I say, look, Hench, you make it to confess. You sick man. You go into the court. I have a lawyer for you. You say to hell with the confess. I was drunk. The damn coppers are stuck. The judge, he turn you loose and you come back to me and I take care of you, okay?" So Hench say, "Okay, I make it to confess." That's all.
I said, "And after 2 or 3 weeks, the bad brother's a long way from here, and the trail is cold, and the cops will likely just write the Phillips killing off as unsolved. Is that it?"
"See."
He smiled again, a brilliant, warm smile like the kiss of death. "That takes care of Hench, Mr. Palermo," I said, "but it doesn't help me much about my friend." He shook his head and looked at his watch. I stood up. Tony stood up. "If I went down to headquarters and told the boys everything you've told me, they'd laugh in my face, and I'd be laughing with them."
"Tony don't laugh much,"
Palermo said. "The earth is full of people who don't laugh much, Mr. Palermo," I said. "You ought to know. You put a lot of them where they are."
"It's my business," he said, shrugging enormously.
In the lobby of the Belfont building, in the single elevator that had light in it, the same watery-eyed relic sat motionless, giving his imitation of the forgotten man. I got in with him and said 6. The elevator lurched into motion and pounded its way upstairs to the 6th floor. I went along the corridor reading the names: H.R. Teager Dental Laboratories. In the same relative position as the Morningstar office 2 floors above, but the rooms were cut up differently. Teager had only one door, and there was more wall space in between his door and the next one. The knob didn't turn. I knocked. There was no answer. I knocked harder with the same result. I went back to the elevator. It was still at the 6th floor. "Know anything about H.R. Teager?" I said. He thought.
"Heavy-set, oldish,
sloppy clothes, dirty fingernails like mine.
Come to think, I didn't see him in today."
"Do you think the super would let me into his office to look around?" "Pretty nosy, the super is. I wouldn't recommend it." He turned his head very slowly and looked up the side of the car. Over his head on a big metal ring, a key was hanging, a pass key. "Right now, I gotta go to the can." He went. When the door had closed behind him, I took the key off the cage wall and went back along to the office of H.R. Teager, unlocked it, and went in. Inside it there was a square office with 2 curtained east windows and very dusty sills. The wire basket was full of junk. I almost wasted 10 minutes going through it rather carefully. At the end of that time I knew what I was pretty sure of already, that H.R. Teager carried on a small business as a dental technician doing laboratory work for a number of dentists in unprosperous sections of the city. I did find one thing. Teager's home address at 1354B, Toberman Street, on the receipted part of a gas bill. I switched off the lamp and left. The elevator was downstairs again. I rang for it, and when it came up, I sidled in, hiding the key, and hung it up. The ring tinkled against the cage. Toberman Street, a wide, dusty street off Pico, number 1354B, was an upstairs flat in a yellow and white frame building. I kept on ringing the bell even after I was sure that nobody would answer it. The door of 1354A was pulled open, and a small, bright-eyed woman looked out at me. "You want Mrs. Teager?" she shrilled. "Mr. or Mrs. They gone away last night on the vacation. They had me stop the milk in the paper." "Thanks. What kind of car do they drive?" The bright-eyed woman said, "You a friend of theirs?" "Never mind. All we want is our money." "Lots of ways to find out what car they were driving," I said, and went back to my car and drove on home to Hollywood. The office was empty. I unlocked my inner room and threw the windows up and sat down. The telephone rang. I answered it, and the voice said, "Mr. Marlowe, this is Mr. Shaw at the Bristol." "Yes, Mr. Shaw. How are you?" "I'm very well, thanks, Mr. Marlowe. I hope you are the same. There's a young lady here asking to be let into your apartment. Her name is Davis, Miss Merle Davis. She's, what shall I say, quite verging on the hysterical." "Let her in," I said rapidly. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. She's the secretary of a client. It's a business matter entirely." "Quite. Shall I, remain with her?" "Whatever you think," I said, and hung up. As I turned the key in my door and opened it, Shaw was already standing up from the Davenport. The girl sat in my easy chair behind the chess table. "Ah, there you are, Mr. Marlowe," Shaw chirped. "I'll just run along now." He nodded and was gone. I said, "Hello there." She said hello. Her voice was quite calm, quite serious. Except for her face, she would have looked all right. In the first place, her eyes were quite mad. In addition to this, there was something wrong with her neck, so that very slowly her head was drawn around to the left about 45 degrees. It would stop there, her neck would twitch, and her head would slide back the way it had come. "You're not wearing your glasses," I said. "Oh, I only wear them around the house and for reading. They're in my bag." "You're in the house now," I said. "You ought to be wearing them." I turned my body a little as I opened the bag. I fished the glass case out and slid it across the table. She put them on. That helped her appearance a lot, I thought. While she was doing this, I got the gun out of her bag and slid it into my hip pocket. I didn't think she saw me. It looked like the same Colt .35 automatic with a walnut grip that I had seen in the top right-hand drawer of her desk the day before. "I've been over to Mr. Vanier's house," she said. "Oh. He lives in Sherman Oaks, at the end of Escamillo Drive. How long have you known Mr. Vanier?" "I've known him 8 years. I haven't known him very well. I've had to take him a parcel now and then. He liked to have me bring it myself. I never liked him very well. I was afraid he would. But he didn't," I said. For the first time, her face got a human, natural expression. Surprise. "No," she said, "he didn't. That is, he didn't really, but he had his pajamas on." "Taking it easy," I said, "lying around all afternoon with his pajamas on. Well, some guys have all the luck, don't they?" "Well, you have to know something," she said seriously, "something that makes people pay you money." "How much were you taking him today?" "Only $500. Mrs. Murdoch said that was all she could spare, and she couldn't really spare that. She said it would have to stop. Mr. Vanier would always promise to stop, but he never did." So there was only one thing to do. It was all my fault, and Mrs. Murdoch had been so wonderful to me. It couldn't make me any worse than I was already, could it? So I did it, she said. He was there in his pajamas with a glass beside him. He was leering at me. He didn't even get up to let me in, but there was a key in the front door. Someone had left a key there. There wasn't anything to it, really. I don't even remember hearing the noise. There must have been a noise, of course. Quite a loud noise. I suppose so, I said. So I came here, she said. I knew you would know what to do. And what did you touch in the house while you were there, I asked. Oh, I remember one thing, she said. I put the light out. Before I left, it was a lamp, one of these lamps that shine upwards with big bulbs. I nodded and smiled at her. What time was this? How long ago? Oh, just before I came over here. I drove. I had Mrs. Murdoch's car. Let's see, I said. Half an hour to drive here, anyway. That would be about 5:30 when you left Mr. Vanier's house. Where's your home? Why? I live with Mrs. Murdoch. I mean your real home, where your folks are. My parents live in Wichita, she said, but I don't go there, ever. I write once in a while, but I haven't seen them for years. I hope they won't have to know. They didn't about the other time. Mrs. Murdoch kept it from everybody. Maybe they won't have to know, I said. I went around the back of her chair to the kitchen and took the little gun off my hip and saw that the safety was on. I smelled the muzzle, broke out the magazine. There was a shell in the chamber, but it was one of those guns that won't fire when the magazine is out. I held it so that I could look into the breech. The shell in there was the wrong size and was crooked against the breech block. It looked like a .32. The shells in the magazine were the right size, 25s. I fitted the gun together again and went back to the living room. I hadn't heard a sound. She had just slid forward in a pile in front of the chair. She was as cold as a mackerel. I went to the phone and called Carl Moss. Phil Marlowe, Doc. Any more patients, or are you through? All through, he said. Leaving. Trouble? I'm home, I said. 408 Bristol Apartments, if you don't remember. I've got a girl here who's pulled a faint. I'm not afraid of the faint. I'm afraid she may be nuts when she comes out of it. I'm on my way. I hung up and knelt down beside her. I began to rub her temples. She opened her eyes. Do you mind if I lift you up and put you on the Davenport? I lifted her. She went stiff on me, but she didn't say anything. I put her on the Davenport and tucked her skirt down over her legs and put a pillow under her head. Did you call the police? She asked softly. Not yet, I said. I've been too busy. I opened her bag and turned my back to her to slip the gun back into it. I pulled open the zipper pocket at the back. That held her driver's license and a flat packet of bills. Tucked into the rubber band that held them was a folded paper. I took it out and opened it and read it. It was a common receipt form, and it would, when signed, acknowledge the receipt of $500. Payment on account. It didn't seem as if it would ever be signed now. I slipped money and receipt into my pocket. Dr. Carl Moss was a big burly man with a Hitler mustache, pop eyes, and the calmness of a glacier. He put his hat and bag in a chair and went over and stood looking down at the girl on the Davenport inscrutably. I'm Dr. Moss, he said. He bent down and felt her pulse and then stood there watching her breathing. Where does it hurt, miss? Davis, I said. Miss Merle Davis. Nothing hurts me, she said, staring up at him. I don't even know why I'm lying here like this. I thought you were the police. You see, I killed a man. Well, that's a normal human impulse, he said. I've killed dozens. He didn't smile. He patted her shoulder and walked out to the kitchen. I went after him. He leaned his hips against the sink and gave me a cool stare. What's the story? She's the secretary of a client, a Mrs. Murdoch in Pasadena. About 8 years ago, a man made a hard pass at Merle. How hard, I don't know. Then, I don't mean immediately, but around that time he fell out of a window or jumped. Since then she can't have a man touch her, not in the most casual way, I mean. Does she think he jumped out of the window on her account? I don't know. Mrs. Murdoch is the man's widow. She married again, and her second husband is dead too. Merle has stayed with her. The old woman treats her like a rough parent treats a naughty child. I see. Regressive. What's that? Emotional shock and the subconscious attempt to escape back to childhood. If Mrs. Murdoch scolds her a good deal, but not too much, that would increase the tendency. Identification of childhood subordination with childhood protection. Do we have to go into that stuff? I growled. Look, pal, the girl's obviously a neurotic. It's partly induced and partly deliberate. I mean to say that she really enjoys a lot of it. Even if she doesn't realize that, she enjoys it. However, that's not of immediate importance. What's this about killing a man? A man named Vanier who lives in Sherman Oaks. There seems to be some blackmail angle. Merle had to take him his money from time to time. I've seen the guy. A nasty type. She went over there this afternoon and she says she shot him. Shot him with what? She had a gun in her bag, but if she shot him, it wasn't with that. The gun's got a wrong cartridge in the breech. It can't be fired as it is. Also, it hasn't been fired. If she thinks she shot him and isn't just acting, that indicates it was not a new idea to her. She may have a guilt complex, wants to be punished, wants to expiate some real or imaginary crime. What do you want me to do with her? She's not going back to Pasadena. Any family? In Wichita. I'll call, but she'll have to stay here tonight. Does she trust you enough to spend the night in your apartment? She came here of her own free will, not socially, so I guess she does. Well, I'll give her some Nembutal and we'll put her to bed, and you can walk the floor wrestling with your conscience. I have to go over there and see what's happened, and she can't stay here alone, and no man, not even a doctor, is going to put her to bed. Get a nurse. I'll sleep somewhere else. Phil Marlowe, he said, the shop-soiled Galahad. Okay. I'll stick around until the nurse comes. He telephoned the nurse's registry. I put my hat on and left. On the way down in the elevator, I remembered that there hadn't been any keys in her bag. So I stopped at the lobby floor and went out through the lobby to the Bristol Avenue side. The car was not hard to find. It was parked crookedly about 2 feet from the curb. It was a gray Mercury convertible. A leather key holder hung in the lock. I got into the car, started the engine, saw that there was plenty of gas, and drove it away. Escamillo Drive was very narrow, averaged about 5 houses to a block, and was overhung by a section of shaggy brown foothill on which nothing lived at this season, except sage and manzanita. In the last block were 3 houses, 2 on the opposite entering corners, 1 at the dead end. That was Vanier's. My spotlight showed the key still in the door. The front door was made of iron-bound oak planks, beveled where they joined. It was a thumb latch instead of a knob. The head of the flat key projected from the lock. I rang the bell, and it rang with that remote sound of a bell ringing at night in an empty house. I opened the front door, leaving the key in the lock. I felt around on the wall inside the door for a light switch, found one, and tilted it up. Pale flame bulbs in pairs and wall brackets went on all around the room, showing me the big lamp Merle had spoken of, as well as other things. I went over to switch the lamp on, then back to switch the wall light off. 2 Davenports angled across the corners of the room, and there was 1 gold chair, 1 pink chair, 1 brown chair, 1 brown and gold jacquard chair with footstool. Yellow pajama legs were on the footstool. Bare ankles, feet in dark green Morocco leather slippers. My eyes ran up from the feet, slowly, carefully. A dark green figured silk robe tied with a tasseled belt. A yellow neck, the face turned sideways, pointed at a mirror on the wall. I walked around and looked in the mirror. The face leered, all right. The left arm and hand lay between a knee and the side of the chair. The right arm hung outside the chair, the ends of the fingers touching the rug. touching also the butt of a small revolver about .32 caliber, a belly gun with practically no barrel. The right side of the face was against the back of the chair, but the right shoulder was dark brown with blood, and there was some on the right sleeve, also on the chair. I didn't think his head had taken that position naturally. Some sensitive soul had not liked the right side of it. On the table at his right elbow was half of a dead drink, an ashtray full of butts and ash. 3 of the butts had lipstick on them, bright Chinese red lipstick, what a blonde would use. I poked through the rest of the house, putting lights on and off. The kitchen was small. There were a lot of bottles in the sink. I wandered back to the jacquard chair and set my teeth and grabbed enough of his hair to pull the head away from the chair back. The bullet had gone in at the temple. The setup could be for suicide, but people like Louis Vanier do not commit suicide. A blackmailer, even a scared blackmailer, has a sense of power and loves it. I let the head go back where it wanted to go and leaned down to scrub my hand on the nap of the rug. Leaning down, I saw the corner of a picture frame under the lower shelf of the table at Vanier's elbow. I went around and reached for it with a handkerchief. The glass was cracked across. It had fallen off the wall. I could make a guess how it had happened. Somebody standing at Vanier's right, even leaning over him, somebody he knew and had no fear of, had suddenly pulled the gun and shot him in the right temple. And then, startled by the blood or the recoil of the shot, the killer had jumped back against the wall and knocked the picture down. It had landed on a corner and jumped under the table, and the killer had been too careful to touch it, or too scared. I looked at it. It was a small picture, not interesting at all. A guy in doublet and hose with lace at his sleeve ends, and one of those round puffy velvet hats with a feather, leaning far out of a window and apparently calling out to somebody downstairs. Downstairs not being in the picture. It was a color reproduction of something that had never been needed in the first place. A man leaning out of a high window, a long time ago. The touch of the idea at first was so light that I almost missed it and passed on. A high window, a man leaning out, a long time ago. It snapped in place. It was so hot it sizzled. Out of a high window a long time ago, 8 years ago, a man leaning too far, a man falling to his death, a man named Horace Bright. Mr. Vanier, I said with a little touch of admiration, you played that rather neatly. I turned the picture over. On the back, dates and amounts of money were written. Dates over almost 8 years, amounts mostly of $500, a few 750s, 2 for 1,000. There was a running total in small figures. It was $11,000. Mr. Vanier had not received the latest payment. He had been dead when it arrived. The cardboard back was fastened into the frame with steel Victrola needles. 2 of them had fallen out. I worked the cardboard loose and tore it a little, getting it loose. There was a white envelope between the back and the picture. Sealed blank. I tore it open. It contained 2 square photographs and a negative. The photographs were just the same. They showed a man leaning far out of a window with his mouth open, yelling. His hands were on the brick edges of the window frame. There was a woman's face behind his shoulder. He was a thinnish, dark-haired man. His face was not very clear, nor the face of the woman behind him. He was leaning out of a window and yelling or calling out. I kept on looking at it. And in a little while something was wrong. It was a very small thing, but it was vital. The position of the man's hands, lined against the corner of the wall where it was cut out to make the window frame. The hands were not holding anything. They were not touching anything. It was the inside of his wrists that lined against the angle of the bricks. The hands were in the air. The man was not leaning. He was falling. I put the stuff back in the envelope and folded the cardboard back and stuffed that into my pocket also. I hid the frame, glass and picture, in the linen closet under towels. All this had taken too long. A car stopped outside the house. Feet came up the walk. I dodged behind the curtains in the archway. The front door opened and then quietly closed. There was a silence hanging in the air like a man's breath in frosty air, and then a thick scream ending in a wail of despair, then a man's voice, tight with fury, saying, "Not bad, not good, try again." The woman's voice said, "My God, he's dead, Alex. Do something. For God's sake, do something." "Yeah," the hard, tight voice of Alex Morney said. I ought to make you look just like him. 8 months married and cheating on me with a piece of merchandise like that. My God, what did I ever think of to put in with a chippy like you?" The woman made another wailing noise. "Quit stalling," Morney said bitterly. "What do you think I brought you over here for? You're not kidding anybody. You've been watched for weeks. You were here last night. I've been here already today. I've seen what there is to see. Your lipstick on cigarettes, your glass that you drank out of. I can see you now sitting on the arm of his chair, rubbing his greasy hair and then feeding him a slug while he was still purring." "Oh, Alex, darling, don't say such awful things." "Skip the agony, Toots. I don't give one little flash in hell about you anymore. But I do care about myself and my reputation and my business. For instance, did you wipe the gun off?" Silence. Then the sound of a blow. The woman wailed. She was hurt, terribly hurt. Hurt in the depths of her soul. She made it rather good. "Look, Angel," Morney snarled, "don't feed me the ham. You're going to tell me how this was done if I have to drag you around the room by your hair. Now, did you wipe off the gun?" Suddenly she laughed. Then she stopped laughing just as suddenly. Her voice said, "Yes." "And the glass you were using?" "Yes." "And you put his prints on the gun?" "Yes." He thought almost in silence. "Probably won't fool them," he said. "It's almost impossible to get a dead man's prints on a gun in a convincing way. Show me how you did it, how you were standing, how you held the gun." She didn't move. "Never mind about the prints," Morney said. "I'll put better ones on, much better ones." She moved slowly across the opening of the curtains, and I saw her. Her face was smeared with tears. "Pick it up!" Morney yelled at her. "Show me!" She bent beside the chair and came up with the gun in her hand and her teeth bared. She pointed the gun across the opening in the curtains, towards the space of the room where the door was. Morney didn't move, didn't make a sound. The blonde's hand began to shake and the gun did a queer up and down dance in the air. "I can't do it," she breathed. "I ought to shoot you, but I can't." The hand opened and the gun thudded to the floor. Morney went swiftly past the break in the curtains, pushed her out of the way, and with his foot pushed the gun back to about where it had been. He whipped a handkerchief out and bent to pick the gun up again. He pressed something and the gate fell open. He reached his right hand into his pocket and rolled a cartridge in his fingers, moving his fingertips on the metal, pushed the cartridge into a cylinder. He repeated the performance 4 times more, snapped the gate shut, then opened it and spun it a little to set it in a certain spot. He placed the gun down on the floor, withdrew his hand and handkerchief, and straightened up. "You couldn't shoot me," he sneered, "because there was nothing in the gun but one empty shell. Now it's loaded again. The cylinders are in the right place. 1 shot has been fired and your fingerprints are on the gun." The blonde was very still, looking at him with haggard eyes. "I forgot to tell you," he said softly. "I wiped the gun off. I thought it would be so much nicer to be sure your prints were on it. I was pretty sure they were, but I felt as if I would like to be quite sure. Get it?" The girl said quietly, "You're going to turn me in?" "Yeah, Angel, I'm going to turn you in. Some people are going to be sorry for me and some people are going to laugh at me, but it's not going to do my business any harm. That's one nice thing about a business like mine. A little notoriety won't hurt it at all." "So I'm just publicity value to you now," she said. "Apart, of course, from the danger that you might have been suspected yourself." "Just so," he said. "How about my motive?" I don't know, he said. You were up to something with him. Eddie tailed you downtown to a street on Bunker Hill where you met a blonde guy in a brown suit. Eddie dropped you and tailed the guy to an apartment house near there. I don't know what it was all about. I know one thing, though. In that apartment house, a young guy named Phillips was shot yesterday. Would you know anything about that, my sweet? The blonde said, I wouldn't know anything about it. I don't know anybody named Phillips, and strangely enough, I didn't just run up and shoot anybody out of sheer girlish fun. But you shot Vanier, my dear, Morny said almost gently. Oh, yes, she drawled, of course. We were wondering what my motive was. You get it figured out yet? You can work that out with the Johns, he snapped. Call it a lover's quarrel. Perhaps, she said, when he was drunk he looked just a little like you. Perhaps that was the motive. He stepped forward and swung a fist. It caught her on the side of the face, and she went down and sat on the floor. A long leg straight out in front of her, one hand to her jaw, her very blue eyes looking up at him. She got to her feet slowly, still with a hand to her jaw. Then she smiled. I knew he was dead, she said. That's my key in the door. I'm quite willing to go downtown and say I shot him, but don't lay your smooth white paw on me again, if you want my story. Morny turned and I saw the hard white leer of his face and the scarred dimple in his cheek twitching. The front door opened again. The blonde stood still a moment, looked back over her shoulder at the corpse, shuddered slightly and passed out of my line of vision. The door closed. Steps on the walk. Then car doors opening and closing. The motor throbbed and the car went away. After a long time I went over and picked the gun up and wiped it off very carefully and put it down again. I picked the 3 rouge-stained cigarette stubs out of the tray on the table and carried them into the bathroom and flushed them down the toilet. Then the nasty part. I kneeled on the rug by his chair and picked up the gun and reached for the trailing bone-stiff hand. The prints would not be good, but they would be prints, and they wouldn't be Lois Morney's. An index print on the right side of the barrel, 2 fingers on the trigger guard, a thumbprint on the flat piece on the left side behind the chambers. Good enough. I opened the front door, pulled the key out, and wiped it off and pushed it back into the lock. I shut the door and wiped the thumb latch off and went my way down the block to the Mercury. I drove back to Hollywood and locked the car up and started along the sidewalk past the other parked cars to the entrance of the Bristol. A harsh whisper spoke to me out of the darkness, out of a car. Eddie Prue's long blank face hung somewhere up near the roof of a small Packard behind its wheel. How you making out, Seamus? I said, who dropped that dental supply company's bill you gave me last night? Vanier or somebody else? Vanier. What was I supposed to do with it? Guess the life history of a man named Teager? I don't go for dumb guys, Eddie Prue said. I said, seeing that I'm a dumb guy, explain to me why a bill for dental supplies should get anybody all excited and start trying to hire private detectives, especially gents like Alex Morney who don't like private detectives. Don't you know what they use that dental stuff for? Yeah. They use albastone for making molds of teeth and cavities. The other stuff, cristobalite, is used to cook out the wax in an invested wax model. I guess you know how they make gold inlays, Eddie Prue said. You ever read the paper? Once in a while. It couldn't be you read where an old guy named Morningstar was bumped off in the Belfont building on 9th Street, just 2 floors above where this H.R. Teager had his office. I didn't answer him. Nobody could be as dumb as you act, he said softly. Good night to you. The car moved away from the curb and drifted down the hill towards Franklin. I went up to the apartment and unlocked the door and pushed it open a few inches and then knocked gently. The door was pulled open by a strong-looking girl with a black stripe on the cap of her white nurse's uniform. I'm Marlowe. I live here. Come in, Mr. Marlowe. Dr. Moss told me. I shut the door quietly and we spoke in low voices. How is she? I asked. She's asleep. She was already drowsy when I got here. I'm Miss Lymington. Is she hard enough asleep so that I could go in and get a few things to take to the hotel? Oh yes, if you're quiet. I went over and put some money on the desk. There's coffee and bacon and eggs and bread and tomato juice and oranges and liquor here, I said. Anything else you'll have to phone for. I went along the hallway and peeked into the bedroom. I poked about in the closet and got a suitcase and put some junk in it. Her eyes opened and looked straight up at the ceiling. Then they moved just enough to see me, and a faint little smile tugged at the corners of her lips. I lied to you, she said softly. I didn't shoot anybody. I know. I was there. Forget it. A couple of tears formed in her eyes and slid down at the corners and rolled gently down her cheeks. Does Mrs. Murdoch know where I am? Not yet. I'm going over and tell her. Will you have to tell her everything? Yeah, why not? She turned the head away from me. She'll understand, her voice said softly. She knows the awful thing I did 8 years ago. Sure, I said. That's why she's been paying Vanier money all this time. Now you're going back to sleep, and tomorrow I'm going to take you on the way back to Wichita to visit your parents at Mrs. Murdoch's expense. Why, that's wonderful of her, she cried, her eyes opening wide and shining. She's a wonderful woman, I said. I'm going over there now, and we're going to have a perfectly lovely little talk over the teacups. And if you don't go to sleep right now, I won't let you confess to any more murders. You're horrid, she said. I don't like you. She turned her head away and shut her eyes. I drove over to Santa Monica Boulevard. The hock shop was still open. The old Jew in the tall black skull cap seemed surprised that I was able to redeem my pledge so soon. I told him that was the way it was in Hollywood. The moonlight lay like a white sheet on the front lawn. A white-haired, red-faced woman I hadn't seen before opened the door, and I said, I'm Philip Marlowe. I'd like to see Mrs. Murdoch, Mrs. Elizabeth Murdoch. She looked doubtful. I think she's gone to bed, she said. It's about Miss Davis, I said. It's important. Could you tell her that? I'll see. I stepped back and let her shut the door. The door opened after a while, and the woman said, You can come in. I was shown into a big sitting room. Mrs. Murdoch was sitting in a padded wing chair with a card table in front of her. She was wearing a quilted robe, and her hair looked a little fluffed out. She was playing solitaire. Merle's at my apartment, I said. She threw an ing-bing. Without looking up, she said, And just what is an ing-bing, Mr. Marlowe? A case of the vapors, they used to call it, I said. I've got a doctor and a nurse. She's asleep. She was over to see Vanier. You sent Merle to Vanier's place this afternoon with $500. And if I did? She poured some of her port and sipped, eyeing me steadily over the glass. When did he ask for it? Yesterday. I couldn't get it out of the bank until today. What happened? Vanier's been blackmailing you for about 8 years, hasn't he? On account of something that happened on April 26, 1933? A sort of panic twitched in the depths of her eyes, but very far back, very dim, and somehow as though it had been there for a long time and had just peeped out at me for a second. Merle told me a few things, I said. Your son told me how his father died. I looked up the records and the papers. Accidental death. There had been an accident in the street under his office, and a lot of people were craning out of windows. He just craned out too far. There was some talk of suicide because he was broke and had $50,000 life insurance for his family. But the coroner was nice and slid past that. Merle was Horace Bright's secretary. A queer little girl in a way. Over-timid, not sophisticated. A little girl mentality. Likes to dramatize herself. Very old-fashioned ideas about men, all that sort of thing. I figure he got high one time and made a pass at her and scared her out of her socks. Yes? Another cold, hard monosyllable prodding me like a gun barrel. She brooded and got a little murderous inside. She got a chance and passed right back at him, while he was leaning out of a window. Anything in it? Speak plainly, Mr. Marlowe. I can stand plain talk. Good grief, how plain do you want it? She pushed her employer out of a window, murdered him in 2 words, and got away with it with your help. She nodded. Her chin moved a short inch, down, up. Did Vanier have any evidence, I asked, or did he just happen to see what happened and put the bite on you and you paid him a little now and then to avoid scandal, and because you were really very fond of Merle? He talked about a photograph, she said, but I never believed it. He couldn't have taken one, and if he had taken one, he would have shown it to me, sooner or later. I said, no, I don't think so. It would have been a very fluky shot even if he happened to have the camera in his hand on account of the doings down below in the street. But I can see he might not have dared to show it. How much have you paid him? That's none, she started to say, then stopped and shrugged her big shoulders. $11,100, not counting the $500 I sent this afternoon. Ah, it was pretty darn nice of you, Mrs. Murdoch, considering everything. It was my husband's fault, she said. He was drunk, vile. I don't think he really hurt her, but as you say, he frightened her out of her wits. I can't blame her too much. She's blamed herself enough all these years. She had to take the money to Vanier in person? That was her idea of penance. A strange penance. I nodded. I guess that would be in character. Later you married Jasper Murdoch and you kept Merle with you and took care of her. Anybody else know? Nobody, only Vanier. Surely he wouldn't tell anybody. Well, it's all over now. Vanier is through. She lifted her eyes slowly and gave me a long, level gaze. I said Merle came to my apartment. She told me she'd shot Vanier. Her breath was a faint, swift whisper in the stillness of the room. She had a gun in her bag, God knows why. Some idea of protecting herself against men, I suppose, but somebody, Leslie I should guess, had fixed it to be harmless by jamming a wrong-sized cartridge into the breech. She told me she'd killed Vanier and fainted. I went over to Vanier's house. There was a key in the door. He was dead in a chair, long dead, cold, stiff. Dead long before Merle went there. She didn't shoot him. Her telling me was just drama. She's in bed in my apartment. I phoned Merle's father long distance. He wants her to come home. That all right with you? She just stared. I thought I'd take her. It seems to be my responsibility now. I'll need that last $500 that Vanier didn't get for expenses. Who killed Vanier? Looks like he committed suicide. A gun at his right hand. Temple contact wound. Morny and his wife were there while I was. I hid. Morny's trying to pin it on his wife. She was playing games with Vanier. So she probably thinks he did it or had it done. But it shapes up like suicide. The cops will be there by now. I don't know what they'll make of it. We just have to sit tight and wait it out. Men like Vanier, she said grimly, don't commit suicide. That's like saying girls like Merle don't push people out of windows. It doesn't mean anything. We stared at each other with that inner hostility that had been there from the first. There was one thing I wanted to ask you, I said. This doubloon business is still cloudy on account of a couple of murders which don't seem to make sense now that you have the coin back. What I wondered was if there was anything about the Murdoch Brasher that might identify it to an expert, to a man like old Morningstar. She thought, sitting still, not looking up. Yes, there might be. The coin-maker's initials, E.B., are on the left wing of the eagle. Usually, I'm told, they're on the right wing. That's the only thing I can think of. I said I think that might be enough. You did actually get the coin back, didn't you? I mean, that wasn't just something said to stop my ferreting around. It's in the strong room at this moment. If you can find my son, he'll show it to you. Well, I'll say good night. Please have Merle's clothes packed and sent to my apartment in the morning. You don't need Merle anymore, now that Vanier's dead. Our eyes locked hard and held locked for a long moment. A queer, stiff smile moved the corners of her lips. I went across the room and out, down the stairs and out into the cheerless, stuffy, unused living room that made me feel like an embalmed corpse just to be in it. The French doors at the back opened, and Leslie Murdoch stepped in and stopped, staring at me. His slack suit was rumpled and also his hair. "Good evening," he said stiffly. "Leaving?" "Not quite yet. I want to talk to you." "I don't think we have anything to talk about." "Oh, yes, we have. A man named Vanier." "Vanier? I hardly know the man. I've seen him around. What I know I don't like." "You know him a little better than that," I said. "All right," he said wearily. "Get on with it. I have a feeling you're going to be very brilliant, remorseless flow of logic and intuition and all that rot, just like a detective in a book." I sat down near him and got a cigarette out. "That's right. We ought to play it together sometime. You got a gun?" "Not with me. I have one. You know that." "Have it with you last night when you called on Vanier?" He shrugged and bared his teeth. "Oh, did I call on Vanier last night?" "I think so." "You smoke Benson & Hedges Virginia cigarettes. They leave a firm ash that keeps its shape. An ashtray at his house had enough of those little gray rolls to account for at least 2 cigarettes, but no stubs in the tray, because he smoked them in a holder, and a stub from a holder looks different. So you removed the stubs. Like it?" "No." His voice was quiet. "That's an example of deduction, but I didn't believe your story for a different reason. This." I took the doubloon out and held it on my hand under his eyes. He stared at it tightly. "It was sent to me by a would-be detective named George Phillips. He'd been following me around, and before that he might have been following you around." He looked genuinely surprised. "Why would he do that?" "I'm not sure he did. He picked me up here, and I don't think he followed me here. He might have been watching the house because he'd been hired to peddle a rare coin to an old coin dealer named Morningstar, and the old coin dealer somehow suspected where the coin came from and told Phillips or hinted to him that the coin was stolen. Incidentally, he was wrong about that. It was a counterfeit." His shoulders gave a quick little jerk as if he was cold. Otherwise he didn't move or change position. "A man named Vanier and a man named Teager had an idea. Teager's a dental technician in the Belfont building, old Morningstar's building. The idea was to counterfeit a rare and valuable gold coin, not too rare to be marketable, but rare enough to be worth a lot of money. The method they thought of was about what a dental technician uses to make a gold inlay, requiring the same materials, the same apparatus, the same skills, but they had to have a model. That's where you came in. You took the doubloon all right, but not to give to Morney. You took it to give to Vanier, right?" He stared at the floor and didn't speak. "Loosen up," I said. "In the circumstances, it's nothing very awful. I suppose he promised you money because you needed it to pay off gambling debts, and your mother is close. But he had a stronger hold over you than that." He looked up quickly, then his face very white, a kind of horror in his eyes. "How did you know that?" he almost whispered. "I found out. Some I was told, some I researched, some I guessed. I'll get to that later. Now Vanier and his pal have made a doubloon and they want to try it out. They wanted to know their merchandise would stand up under inspection by a man supposed to know rare coins. So Vanier had the idea of hiring a sucker and getting him to try to sell the counterfeit to old Morningstar, cheap enough so the old guy would think it was stolen. They picked George Anson Phillips for their sucker through a silly ad he was running in the paper for business. I think Lois Morney was Vanier's contact with Phillips, at first anyway. I don't think she was in the racket. She was seen to give Phillips a small package. This package may have contained the doubloon Phillips was to try to sell, but when he showed it to old Morningstar, he ran into a snag. The old man knew his coin collections and his rare coins. He probably thought the coin was genuine enough. It would take a lot of testing to show it wasn't, but the way the maker's initials was stamped on the coin was unusual and suggested to him that the coin might be the Murdoch Brasher. He called up here and tried to find out. That made your mother suspicious, and the coin was found to be missing, and she suspected Linda, whom she hates, and hired me to get it back and put the squeeze on Linda for a divorce without alimony. Well, old Morningstar threw a scare into Phillips, who wasn't crooked, just dumb. He managed to get Phillips' phone number out of him. I heard the old man call that number, eavesdropping in his office after he thought I'd left. I just offered to buy the doubloon back for $1,000, and Morningstar had taken up the offer, thinking he could get the coin from Phillips, make himself some money, and everything lovely. Meantime, Phillips was watching this house, perhaps to see if any cops were coming or going. He saw me, saw my car, got my name off the registration, and it just happened he knew who I was. He followed me around trying to make up his mind to ask me for help until I braced him in a downtown hotel, and he mumbled about being followed around by a tall guy with a funny eye. That was Eddie Prue. Morny knew his wife was playing games with Vanier and had her shadowed. Prue saw her make contact with Phillips near where he lived on Court Street, and then followed Phillips until he thought Phillips had spotted him, which he had. And Prue may have seen me go to Phillips' apartment on Court Street, because he tried to scare me over the phone and later asked me to come and see Morny. I looked at the bleak, unhappy face of the man sitting opposite me and plowed on. Now we come back to you. When Merle told you your mother had hired a dick, that threw a scare into you. You figured she'd missed the doubloon and you came steaming up to my office and tried to pump me. You got in touch with Vanier. You now had to get the coin back to your mother in a hurry with some kind of story. You met Vanier somewhere and he gave you the doubloon. Chances are it's another counterfeit. He would be likely to hang on to the real one. Now Vanier sees his racket in danger of blowing up before it gets started. Morningstar has called your mother and I've been hired. Morningstar's spotted something. Vanier goes down to Phillips' apartment, sneaks in the back way, and has it out with Phillips, trying to find out where he stands. Phillips doesn't tell him he's already sent the counterfeit doubloon to me. I don't know what Phillips told Vanier, of course, but the chances are he told him the job was crooked, that he knew where the coin came from, and that he was going to the police or to Mrs. Murdoch. And Vanier pulled a gun, knocked him on the head, and shot him. He searched him and the apartment and didn't find the doubloon, so he went to Morningstar. Morningstar didn't have the counterfeit doubloon either, but Vanier probably thought he had. He cracked the old man's skull with a gun butt and went through a safe, left the appearance of a stick-up behind him. Then Mr. Vanier breezed on home, still rather annoyed because he hadn't found the doubloon, but with the satisfaction of a good afternoon's work under his vest. A couple of nice, neat murders. That left you. Murdoch flicked a strained look at me. "Why me?" he asked in a thick, strained voice. "You knew too much. The scheme had gone wrong and Morningstar had been murdered. Vanier couldn't just sit back and hope you wouldn't hear about that. He had to shut your mouth very, very tight, but he didn't have to kill you to do it. In fact, killing you would be a bad move. It would break his hold on your mother." Merle came to my apartment this evening. She'd been over to Vanier's house to bring him some money. Money that had been paid to him off and on for 8 years. I know why. He didn't move. His eyes had almost disappeared into the back of his head. Merle found Vanier dead. She came to me and said she'd killed him. Let's not go into why she thinks she ought to confess to other people's murders. I went over there and he'd been dead since last night. There was a gun lying on the floor by his right hand. It was a gun I'd heard described, a gun that belonged to a man named Hench in an apartment across the hall from Phillips' apartment. Somebody ditched the gun that killed Phillips and took Hench's gun. If Vanier didn't commit suicide, and I don't believe he did, it might still tie him to Phillips, or it might tie somebody else to Phillips, somebody who also killed Vanier. There are reasons why I don't like that idea. Murdoch's head came up. There was a new expression on his face, something bright and shining, and at the same time just a little silly. The expression of a weak man being proud. I said, "I think you killed Vanya. You went over there last night. He told you he was in a jam and that if the law caught up with him, he'd see that you were in the jam with him. Didn't he say something like that?" "Yes," Murdoch said quietly. He was drunk and a bit high, and he seemed to have a sense of power. He said if they got him in the gas chamber, I'd be sitting right beside him. But that wasn't all he said. No. He didn't want to sit in the gas chamber, and he didn't at the time see any very good reason why he should if you kept your mouth good and tight. So he played his trump card. His first hold on you, what made you take the doubloon and give it to him, even if he did promise you money as well, was something about Merle and your father. But last night he wanted something still stronger, so he told you the truth and said he had proof. He shivered, but the light, clear, proud look managed to stay on his face. I pulled a gun on him, he said, almost in a happy voice. After all, she is my mother. Nobody can take that away from you. He stood up very straight, very tall. I went over to the chair he sat in and reached down and put the gun against his face. He had a gun in the pocket of his robe. He tried to get it, but he didn't get it in time. I took it away from him. I put my gun back in my pocket. I put the muzzle of the other gun against the side of his head and told him I'd kill him if he didn't produce his proof and give it to me. He began to sweat and babble that he was just kidding me. I clicked back the hammer on the gun to scare him some more. The gun must have been filed or had a very light action. It went off. I jumped back against the wall and knocked a picture down. I jumped from surprise that the gun went off, but it kept the blood off me. I wiped the gun off and put his fingers around it and then put it down on the floor close to his hand. He was dead at once. It was an accident. Why spoil it? I half sneered. Why not make it a nice, clean, honest murder? That's what happened. I can't prove it, of course, but I think I might have killed him anyway. What about the police? I stood up and shrugged my shoulders. I don't know about the police, I said. They and I are not very good friends on account of they think I'm holding out on them, and God knows they're right. If they find out about the doubloon and that it was the Murdoch brasher, I don't know where you stand. It all depends on how well you stand up to them. Except for Mother's sake, he said, I don't very much care. I've always been a flop. And on the other hand, I said, if the gun has a very light action, and you get a good lawyer and tell an honest story and so on, no jury will convict you. Juries don't like blackmailers. Well, I guess I'll just be running along now, I said. You mean you're going to let me get away with it? His voice was getting a little suspicious again. I'm not going to turn you in if that's what you mean. Beyond that, I guarantee nothing. If I'm involved in it, I'll have to face up to the situation. There's no question of morality involved. I'm not a cop, nor a common informer, nor an officer of the court. You say it was an accident. Okay, it was an accident. I wasn't a witness. I haven't any proof either way. I've been working for your mother, and whatever right to my silence that gives her, she can have. I don't like her. I don't like you. I don't like this house. I didn't particularly like your wife. But I like Merle. She's kind of silly and morbid, but she's kind of sweet, too. And I know what's been done to her and this damn family for the past 8 years, and I know she didn't push anybody out of any window. Does that explain matters? He nodded dumbly. I turned my back on him and went to the door and out. I drove back to Hollywood, bought a pint of good liquor, checked in at the plaza, and sat at the side of the bed staring at my feet and lapping the whiskey out of the bottle. Just like any common bedroom drunk. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were 5 pieces of luggage inside the apartment door, side by side on the carpet. I lit a cigarette and wandered over to the window, and after a while she came through the doorway from the bedroom part of the apartment and stood there looking at me with her eyes dark-ringed and a pale, composed little face without any makeup except on the lips. "I've been a terrible nuisance," she said. "I'm terribly sorry." "Nonsense. I talked to your father and mother both. They're tickled to death. They've only seen you twice in over 8 years, and they feel as if they'd almost lost you. It's very kind of Mrs. Murdoch to let me go. Last night you told me you killed Vanier, and then you told me you didn't. I know you didn't. Vanier was dead a long time before you got there. You went there to give him some money for Mrs. Murdoch." "No, for me," she said. "Although of course it was Mrs. Murdoch's money. I owe her more than I'll ever be able to repay. Of course she doesn't give me much salary, but that would hardly." I said roughly, "Her not giving you much salary is a characteristic touch, and your owing her more than you can ever repay is more truth than poetry. Vanier committed suicide because he had got caught out in a crooked job. You got a severe nervous shock seeing his leering dead face in a mirror, and that shock merged into another one a long time ago, and you just dramatized it in your screwy little way. And you didn't push Horace Bright out of any window," I said. Her face jumped then, and turned startlingly pale. Her hand went to her mouth and stayed there, and her shocked eyes looked at me over it. "I think maybe you think you killed Horace Bright. You had a motive and an opportunity, and just for a second I think you might have had the impulse to take advantage of the opportunity. But it wouldn't be in your nature. At the last minute you'd hold back. But at that last minute probably something snapped and you pulled a feint. He did actually fall, of course, but you were not the one that pushed him." "You were made to think you'd pushed him," I said. "It was done with care, deliberation, and the sort of quiet ruthlessness you only find in a certain kind of woman dealing with another woman. You were just a scapegoat to her." "It's utterly impossible," she said quietly. "Mrs. Murdoch has been wonderful to me always." I got out the white envelope that had been in the back of Vanier's picture. 2 prints in it and a negative. I stood in front of her and put a print on her lap. "Okay, look at it." Vanier took it from across the street. "Why, that's Mr. Bright," she said. "It's not a very good picture, is it?" "And that's Mrs. Murdoch. Mrs. Bright she was then, right behind him. Mr. Bright looks mad." "If he looks mad there," I said, "you ought to have seen him a few seconds later when he bounced." "That's a snapshot of Mrs. Elizabeth Bright Murdoch giving her first husband the heave out of his office window. He's falling. He's screaming with fear. She's behind him and her face is hard with rage, or something. This is what Vanier has had for proof all these years. The Murdochs never saw it, never really believed it existed. I found it last night by a fluke of the same sort that was involved in the taking of the picture, which is a fair sort of justice. Do you begin to understand?" She looked at the photo again and laid it aside. "Mrs. Murdoch has always been lovely to me," she said. "She made you the goat," I said, in the quietly strained voice of a stage manager at a bad rehearsal. "She's a smart, tough, patient woman. She knows her complexes." I hand it to her. I'd like to hand it to her with an elephant gun, but my polite breeding restrains me. "Well," she said, "that's that." And I could see she had heard 1 word in 3 and hadn't believed what she'd heard. I got up and took the photo out of her hand and tore it into small pieces and dropped them in the wastebasket. "Maybe you'll be sorry I did that," I told her, not telling her I had another and the negative. "Maybe some night, 3 months, 3 years from now, you'll wake up in the night and realize I've been telling you the truth. And maybe then you'll wish you could look at the photograph again. And maybe I'm wrong about this too. Maybe you'd be very disappointed to find out you hadn't really killed anybody. Either way, it's fine. Now we're going downstairs and get in my car and we're going to drive to Wichita to visit your parents. And I don't think you're going back to Mrs. Murdoch. But it may well be that I'm wrong about that too. But we are not going to talk about this anymore. I was gone 10 days. I called Lieutenant Breeze when I got back and went down to ask him how the Phillips case was coming. They'd cracked it very neatly with the right mixture of brains and luck you always have to have. The Morneys never went to the police after all, but somebody called and told about a shot in Vanier's house and hung up quickly. The fingerprint man didn't like the prints on the gun too well, so they checked Vanier's hand for powder nitrates. When they found them, they decided it was suicide after all. Then a dick named Lackey working out of Central Homicide thought to work on the gun a little, and he found that a description of it had been distributed, and a gun like it was wanted in connection with the Phillips killing. Hench identified it, but better than that they found a half print of his thumb on the side of the trigger, which not ordinarily being pulled back had not been wiped off completely. With that much in hand and a better set of Vanier's prints than I could make, they went over Phillips' apartment again and also over Hench's. They found Vanier's left hand on Hench's bed and one of his fingers on the underside of the toilet flush lever in Phillips' place. All they lacked now was a motive. Teager obligingly gave them that by getting himself pinched in Salt Lake City trying to peddle a brasher doubloon to a coin dealer who thought it was genuine but stolen. He had a dozen of them at his hotel, and one of them turned out to be genuine. And the police didn't care anymore about Vanier once they were convinced he had done murder. They left it at suicide, although they had a few doubts. They let Teager go after a while because they didn't think he had any idea of murder being done, and all they had on him was attempted fraud. He'd bought the gold legally, and counterfeiting an obsolete New York State coin didn't come under the federal counterfeiting laws. They never believed Hench's confession. Breeze said he just used it for a squeeze in case I was holding out. Like it? Breeze asked me when he had told me all that had happened. 2 points not clear, I said. Why did Teager run away? And why did Phillips live on Court Street under a phony name? Teager ran away because the elevator man told him old Morningstar had been murdered and he smelled a hookup. Phillips was using the name of Anson because the finance company was after his car, and he was practically broke and getting desperate. That explains why a nice young boob like him could get roped into something that must have looked shady from the start. I agreed that could be so. It was night. I went home and put my old house clothes on and set the chessmen out and mixed a drink and played over a Capablanca. It went 59 moves. Beautiful, cold, remorseless chess, almost creepy in its silent implacability. When it was done, I listened at the open window for a while and smelled the night. Then I carried my glass out to the kitchen and stood at the sink, sipping it and looking at my face in the mirror. You and Capablanca, I said.